Oregon Territory. Autumn 1878. She was hauling a 12-foot beam alone when he stepped off the stagecoach. Still carrying all that extra weight, I see. Montgomery Sterling smiled slow, deliberate, pitiful. No man with any sense of standing is going to. The sound of hooves cut him off. A stranger dismounted, walked straight over, lifted the beam from her hands like it was nothing. She's with me. Sterling's smile flickered. Just once. This is the story of a woman who never bowed her head, and the only man who ever deserved to stand beside her. Keep watching. You won't want to miss what happens next. The stagecoach horn screamed before the coach even cleared the ridge. Maeve Hollister heard it from 50 yards away and didn't bother to look up. She had a beam to set. A 12-foot length of Douglas fir, freshly cut and still fragrant, needed to go up against the station wall before the afternoon freight arrived. So she bent her knees, dug her boots into the dry Oregon dirt, and lifted. The beam came up clean. She walked it to the wall herself, shoulder pressed against the grain, boots grinding into the ground with each step. Red dust curled up around her ankles. The autumn air smelled of pine resin and horse sweat, and something like rain coming down from the mountains, though the sky was still bone-white and merciless. She was used to heavy things, had been since she was 14, hauling boards through her father's yard, while other girls her age were practicing embroidery. The work had built her broad shoulders, strong arms, hands that were calloused, and stained with pine pitch that never fully washed out. Her body was full and solid, curved in ways that certain people in this territory had made her deeply ashamed of, once upon a time. She didn't let herself dwell on that. The stagecoach rattled down the main street, raising a curtain of red dust that drifted all the way to where she stood. Oak Haven's Main Street wasn't much a row of timber-fronted buildings, a church at one end, a saloon at the other, and Mrs. Hattie Miller's diner somewhere in the middle, where the whole town came to eat and gossip in equal measure. The coach lurched to a stop in front of the station, and the driver dropped down to unhitch the horses. Maeve lowered the beam against the wall and reached for her chalk line. She heard the coach door open, heard the sound of polished boots on the step, a deliberate sound, the kind that announced a man who wanted to be watched. Then she heard a woman's voice, high, polished, Eastern, saying something about the dust ruining her hem. She still didn't look. Then she heard it, a laugh she hadn't heard in 3 years. Low and smooth, with that particular slide in it, like oil over water. Her chalk line stopped moving. Well, I'll be. The voice came from just behind her left shoulder, close enough to make her skin tighten. Maeve Hollister, still hauling timber like a pack mule. She turned slowly. Montgomery Sterling had aged well, and she hated that. He wore a dark wool coat with brass buttons, a silk cravat, and a hat that had probably cost more than her weekly payroll. He was smiling that wide, easy smile she had once believed in completely. Beside him stood a woman in shimmering dove-gray silk, pale as winter, her face arranged into the careful blankness of someone trained never to show a reaction. Monty's eyes moved over Maeve in one long, deliberate sweep, still carrying all that extra weight. I see. He tilted his head. I suppose some things just don't change. The woman beside him, his wife, clearly looked away toward the diner. Something cold moved through Maeve's chest. Not shame. Not quite. It was older than shame. It was the memory of shame, dredged back up from 3 years ago, when this same man had stood up in front of half the territory and told the assembled wedding guests that he couldn't in good conscience marry a woman who'd let herself go, who'd never learned how to present herself properly, who would embarrass him. She had been 21. She had been wearing her mother's wedding dress. She hadn't cried in front of him. She'd managed that much. Now she looked at him and kept her face still. Montgomery, you know I heard you were still running your father's yard. He pulled out a pocket watch and glanced at it, purely for effect. I thought you might have sold up by now, moved on to something more suited to your well. He smiled again. Particular gifts. Vivian Sterling was studying her boots. Maeve gripped the chalk line in her fist. Her other hand was already curling. She was calculating, not whether to say something back, but what. What would actually land? What would cut through that silk and that brass and that self-satisfied smile and hit something real? 3 years in the East, she said evenly. You come back with a wife and a new coat, and you think that makes you someone. I come back with capital. He stepped closer. Interested parties. Oakhaven is about to see some significant changes, Maeve. Real development. The kind that doesn't come from a woman banging nails alone in a workshop. His eyes dropped to her figure again. Still so alone, isn't it? Pitiful, really. No man with any sense of standing is going to. The sound of hooves cut him off. Not frantic hooves, steady ones, measured. The sound of a horse moving at the pace of someone who wasn't in a hurry because he didn't need to be. A black stallion came up the street and stopped. The man in the saddle sat easy, one hand on the reins, hat pulled low against the afternoon glare. He wore trail-worn clothes canvas trousers, a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, a Stetson that had seen real weather. His face was tan and weathered, and he had a quality to him, a stillness, that made you notice him without knowing exactly why. He swung down from the saddle in one motion and walked over. He walked past Maeve's side and reached the beam leaning against the wall, and he took it up 12 feet of solid fir and held it like it was nothing remarkable. Then he turned and stood beside her, close enough to be unmistakable. And he looked at Montgomery Sterling, not with anger, not with any kind of heat at all, just looked at him. Then he tipped the brim of his Stetson toward Monty, just barely, just enough. She's with me, he said, low, quiet, a drawl that carried without being raised. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving down the street and a horse stomping somewhere behind the station. Monty's smile flickered, just once. Then he pulled it back into place, but it sat differently now, tighter at the corners. He looked between Maeve and this stranger with the measured eyes and the effortless hold on a 12-foot beam, and something shifted in the way he was standing. Well, he adjusted his cravat. I see. I imagine you do, the man said. Monty put his hand at the small of Vivian's back. She flinched, barely, at the touch and steered her toward the hotel at the end of the block. He didn't look back, but Maeve noticed the stiffness in his shoulders as he walked. She exhaled. The man lowered the beam back against the wall without a word, easy as setting down a hat. He turned and looked at her. His eyes were a dark, steady brown. He had a burn scar on his left forearm, red-brown and old, running from wrist to mid-arm. She noticed it, the way you noticed something you instinctively filed away. You didn't need me to do that, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. All right. He went back to his horse, patted the animal on the neck once, and began wrapping the reins around the hitching post. Maeve watched him for a moment. Who are you? He glanced back. Jed Sterling. She blinked. Sterling. No relation to what you're thinking. He said it without expression, which told her there was probably a long story attached to it that he didn't feel like telling. I'm looking to rent a stall for my horse and a room near the stockyards. You know who to ask in this town? Mrs. Miller at the diner, Maeve said. She knows everybody. He nodded, picked up his saddlebag, darted toward the diner. He paused after a few steps and looked back over his shoulder. I was serious, by the way. That man doesn't respect a single thing in this world. Don't give him the satisfaction of knowing he got to you. Maeve looked at him for a beat. He didn't get to me. Jed studied her a second longer than was comfortable. Then he gave a short nod, turned, and walked on. She stood in the afternoon dust, with her chalk line in her hand, and her heart doing something she couldn't quite name. The beam was still leaning against the wall. The stagecoach was pulling away. Down at the end of the block, Montgomery Sterling disappeared through the hotel door without looking back. Maeve picked up the chalk line. She had work to do. Inside Mrs. Miller's diner, the smell of fresh bread and coffee hit you before you crossed the threshold. Hattie Miller ran the place the way she ran everything, with both hands, a sharp eye, and a complete unwillingness to tolerate nonsense. She was 60 and looked it, with strong arms and silver hair pinned up in a practical knot, and when she liked you, she fed you, and when she didn't like you, she still fed you, but she charged more. She'd heard about the scene at the station before the dust had even settled. This was Oakhaven. That was how it worked. When Maeve came in that evening later than usual, boot heels loud on the plank floor, still wearing her work apron, Hattie set down a plate of roast chicken and biscuits without being asked and dropped into the chair across from her. "Well," Hattie said. "I don't want to talk about it," Maeve said. "Of course you don't." Hattie poured coffee into 2 cups. Montgomery Sterling, back in Oakhaven with a society wife and a full change of personality. Heard he told people in the street he's got investment capital. Heard he was rude to you inside of 30 seconds. Maeve didn't confirm or deny. She picked up a biscuit and bit into it. "Who was the other one?" Hattie asked. "The man with the black horse. Said his name is Jed Sterling." Maeve set the biscuit down. "Claims no relation." Hattie raised an eyebrow. "Claims. I know." Maeve wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The day had wrung her out in a way she wasn't going to admit to anyone. She'd managed to stand straight, managed not to let Monty's words find the old wounds she kept carefully sealed. But managing cost something. "It always did," he said. "He needs a room. I told him to come see you." "He already did." Hattie leaned back. "Quiet, man. Polite. Paid 2 weeks up front in hard coin." She studied Maeve. "You all right?" "Fine, Maeve," I said. "Fine, Hattie." Her voice was even, but she looked down at her plate. "I'm fine. I handled it." Hattie reached across and squeezed her hand once firmly and said nothing more about it. That night, lying in the upstairs room of her father's house above the workshop, Maeve listened to the wind come down off the mountain and stared at the ceiling. She could still hear it, that voice, that laugh, the way his eyes had moved over her like she was a ledger entry in the wrong column. She pressed her palms flat against the mattress and breathed. He didn't get to do this anymore. She'd decided that 3 years ago, the morning after the wedding that didn't happen, when she'd rolled up her sleeves and gone back into the workshop and started building. He didn't get to live in her chest. She was still deciding whether she believed that when she fell asleep. The workshop smelled like pine and iron and hard work, which was how Maeve liked it. She was at the bench by first light, working a piece of walnut with a hand plane, pulling long curls of wood off the surface in clean, steady strokes. The plane had been her father's. The bench had been her father's. Most of what was in this workshop had been her father's, and she had kept all of it and added to it and made it hers in ways he'd never quite imagined, because he'd never imagined her as the person who would run it. He'd meant well. Most people who underestimated her had meant well. Outside, the town was waking up. She could hear the blacksmith 2 streets over, the creak of wagon wheels, someone's dog announcing the morning to no one in particular. Oakhaven was a small world, and in a small world, word traveled faster than weather. She'd been in the diner twice in the past 2 days and overheard things both times. Montgomery Sterling, back in town with capital to invest. Montgomery Sterling, interested in acquiring certain parcels in the northern quarter. Montgomery Sterling, asking pointed questions about who owned the Hollister land and what it might be worth, her land. She pushed down harder on the plane. She heard the knock at the workshop door at 7:30, measured raps, spaced evenly, not tentative but not demanding either. She set down the plane. "It's open." Jedediah Sterling came in and stopped just inside the doorway. He looked around the workshop, the way people who actually understood workspaces looked at them, taking in the organization, the tools on their hooks, the projects at various stages laid out on the secondary bench. His eyes moved without hurry. He said nothing for a moment. "Good workshop," he said finally. "I know." She leaned against the bench. "You need something." He turned his hat in his hands. He did that, she'd noticed held his hat, rather than keeping it on indoors. It was an old habit, a courteous one. "I've got a problem," he said, "and I think you might have the same one." She crossed her arms. "Say it plain." He nodded. "I'm looking to bid on the northern grazing leases come spring. Good land, right for what I do, but the land office requires a territorial residency established at least 60 days prior." He paused. "I've been living out of a bedroll for the better part of 2 years. I don't have a local address of record, and I heard about your situation." His voice was straightforward. No apology in it, no edge either. "Sterling Monty is sniffing around your land. Town's talking. He's trying to position himself as some kind of returning hero with money to spend. And he's already started the kind of talk that makes people wonder whether a woman alone can hold a property claim against serious legal pressure." "Can I?" she said, very flat. "Yes," he said it without hesitation. "But that's not the point. The point is, he's going to make it hard. He's going to find every legal gray area he can and stand in it and smile." Jed looked at her steadily. "I was thinking we could help each other." The shop was quiet. Outside, a cart rolled past. Maeve picked up the hand plane and turned it over in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of it. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A formal arrangement," he said. "Temporary. 1 month. We present ourselves to the town as courting. You let me use your property address for residency of record. I stay on as a working hand, handle the heavy labor, keep Monty at a distance. And we both go about our business without him having an easy target to aim at." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know how that sounds. It sounds practical," he said, "which is the only reason I'm saying it. People will talk. People are already talking." His voice was quiet and level. "This way, at least the talking works in your favor instead of his." She set the plane back on the bench, walked to the window, and looked out at the lumber yard, the stacked boards, the drying shed, the fence her father had built, and she'd rebuilt twice since then. Her father's name was still on the sign out front. She'd kept it that way on purpose. She thought about Monty's face at the station, that smile, the way he'd looked at her like she was an inconvenience to be managed. "I want it in writing," she said. Jed blinked once. "All right. And I set the terms." "All right. And you understand that what I'm agreeing to is a business arrangement, nothing more." "That's all I'm asking for," he said. And there was something in his voice, no disappointment, no deflection, just simple agreement that made her believe him in a way she hadn't expected to. She turned from the window. "Come to the workbench." She pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer and a good pen and wrote it out herself in clear, even strokes. 1 month commencing that date. Jed Sterling, in exchange for use of the Hollister workshop address as legal residency of record, would serve as a working hand at the Hollister lumber yard, no wages to be paid, room in the back quarters to be provided, labor to be agreed upon by both parties. The arrangement was to be presented to the town as a courtship. Either party could dissolve the agreement with 3 days' written notice. She wrote it all down. Then she slid it across the bench. Jed read it through twice. She watched him read. He read carefully, which she appreciated. She'd met too many people who skimmed and then complained later about what they hadn't understood. He set it down. Fair. He pulled out a small folding knife, pressed his thumb against the edge not hard enough to cut, just to check the sharpness, and then set it back. Old scout habit, probably. She didn't ask. He picked up the pen. Their hands were close when he leaned over the paper to sign. She noticed his, because she noticed hands the way a woodworker always did. They told you things about a person. His were calloused across the palm and the base of the fingers, leather-worn, with a particular roughness on the right hand that came from rope work. The burn scar ran down the back of his forearm and stopped just above the wrist, old enough to be fully healed, but new enough that she could still read what kind of fire had made it. Signed his name, and straightened, she signed below him. For a moment, they both looked at the paper on the bench, the two signatures side by side, and neither of them said anything. "Back quarters are through that door," she said finally. "There's a cot, a stove, a window that sticks in the cold. I'll show you the tool rules later. Every tool goes back where it came from. Clean. That's not negotiable. Understood, he picked up his hat. And one more thing. She looked at him directly. If you ever speak to me the way Monty spoke to me, or look at me the way he looked at me, this arrangement ends the same day. Are we clear? He met her eyes. Crystal, she nodded once. All right then. You can start by helping me move those fir planks from the drying shed. Stacking order matters, I'll show you. He followed her out through the back. The first few days were an adjustment. Jed moved into the back quarters with a bedroll, a saddlebag, and a second pair of boots, and he made so little noise that twice Maeve walked into the workshop, not knowing he was already there. He didn't try to run things or redirect work or offer suggestions she hadn't asked for. He came when work needed doing and stepped aside when it didn't. He was, in the simplest terms, useful, which was rarer than it should have been. He could read lumber. That surprised her. Most people who worked around wood just carried it. Jed would pick up a board and run a hand down the length of it and know which direction it wanted to bend, which face had the tighter grain, whether the drying had been even. He didn't advertise that he knew this. He just worked accordingly. She started watching him more carefully. After she noticed that, the town noticed them together. Naturally, that was unavoidable in Oakhaven. By the second day, there were eyes following them down the main street. And by the fourth day, Mrs. Miller had already winked at Maeve twice across the diner counter, with an expression that Maeve refused to engage with. Monty noticed, too. She saw him twice from a distance that week. Once outside the land office, once at the far end of the street, talking to two men she didn't recognize, well-dressed, city men, the kind who wore their money carefully. He was watching her. She could feel it, the way you felt a change in the air before rain. He was waiting for something. She didn't know what yet. On the fourth evening, Jed came in from the yard while she was eating supper at the workbench she often ate there, surrounded by the work in progress, which she'd given up, trying to explain to people who found it strange. He stopped when he saw her plate. She'd given herself a modest serving. Bread, some cold chicken, not much else. She'd been doing that lately, eating less than she wanted, an old reflex that came back when she was being watched and judged. Jed looked at the plate, looked at her, didn't say anything for a moment. Then he went to the shelf where she kept the bread, and he sliced two more thick pieces. He went to the crock and scooped out more chicken. He came back to the bench and set it all down beside her plate, and without ceremony or performance, he moved it onto her plate until the plate was full. She looked at it, looked at him. Your body needs fuel to build masterpieces, Maeve. His voice was level, not harsh, not soft, just steady, like a post driven deep in good ground. Don't ever starve yourself for the sake of fools who couldn't lift a hammer if their lives depended on it. She was quiet for a moment. There was no pity in what he'd said, no careful tiptoeing around her feelings. He hadn't treated her like a problem to be handled or a wound to be tended. He just stated a fact and meant it, the way he meant most things, simply, completely, without ornamentation. She picked up her fork. You're not wrong, she said. I know. She almost laughed at that. Almost. She ate the full plate, and he sat on the stool by the door and cleaned tack in silence. And outside, the mountain wind came down through the pines and rattled the workshop windows gently, the way it always did in the autumn evenings. After a while, he said, without looking up from the harness in his hands, Monty's been at the land office. I heard it in town. Her fork paused. Doing what? Asking questions about the Hollister parcel, property lines, whether there's a survey on record, whether any debts are registered against it. He worked the leather conditioner into the buckle leather with steady strokes. He's building a case for something. He can build all he wants. Her voice came out harder than she intended. That land is registered in my name, free and clear. My father paid it off before he died, and I've paid every tax since. Good. He set the harness down. You got the papers somewhere safe? Fireproof lockbox. Under the secondary bench. He nodded. like that was exactly the right answer. Might be worth getting copies made. Courthouse and one with Judge Vance. She hadn't thought of Vance. Aldous Vance was the territorial magistrate, old, careful, principled to a fault. If there was going to be a legal fight, having Vance on record ahead of it was smart. She filed the thought away. You know a lot about this kind of thing, she said. I've had to, he said it simply, and didn't elaborate. She didn't push. She'd learned already that Jed's silences weren't evasion. They were just the shape of a man who'd decided that words had to earn their place. She could respect that. It was actually, she thought, a considerable relief. She pushed the last piece of bread through the gravy on her plate and finished it. I need to show you how to check the blade angles on the draw knives tomorrow, she said. They've been used wrong, and the edges are gone. I need someone who can hold steady while I regrind. I can do that. And the north fence line needs 2 new posts before winter. I saw that. I'll get the auger. She stacked her dishes and stood, and the lamplight fell warm and yellow across the workshop, across the tools on their hooks and the work in progress, and the signed agreement still visible on the corner of the bench, 2 names side by side on plain paper. She glanced at it once as she passed. 1 month, she reminded herself, a business arrangement. Practical and nothing more. She blew out the lamp on her way to the stairs. In the back quarters, she could hear Jed moving, the quiet sounds of a man settling in for the night. Boots on the floor, the small stove being banked down. No fuss, no drama. She lay down on her own bed upstairs and listened to the mountain wind and thought, without meaning to, about the steadiness of his voice when he'd told her to eat. Not because she was fragile, not to fix her, just because she deserved to take care of herself. And he'd said it like that was obvious, like it wasn't complicated, or loaded with history, or tangled up in everything Monty had tried to make her feel about her own body. Just a fact, a simple, firm, undeniable fact. She pulled the quilt up and closed her eyes. Outside, Oak Haven settled into dark. The mountains held the cold. Somewhere in the northern quarter, she knew, Montgomery Sterling was in a fine hotel room, planning something. She could feel it like a splinter you can't quite see present, irritating, not yet deep enough to be dangerous, but heading there. 1 month, she thought again. She'd deal with whatever was coming. She always had. Sleep came faster than she expected. And for once, it came without the old, familiar ache of standing in a wedding dress in front of people who were watching her be left. That, she thought, just before she went under, was something. The first thing Jed did every morning was check the horses. Maeve noticed this by the 3rd day. Before he touched a tool, before he came in for coffee, before he did anything else, he went to the small paddock at the back of the property where his black stallion was stabled, and he spent 20 minutes just being with the animal. No particular agenda. He'd check the hooves, run a hand down each leg, look at the eyes, talk to the horse in a low voice. She couldn't quite hear from the workshop window. She wasn't watching him on purpose. She was just at the window, getting light. The stallion, she'd heard Jed call him Colt, which struck her as either lazy naming or a private joke, was a particular horse, skittish around strangers, perfectly calm around Jed. It would press its forehead against his shoulder and stand there, and Jed would stand there too, 1 hand on the horse's neck, looking out at the mountain line like he was reading something in it. She went back to her bench. There was plenty to read in that mountain line this time of year. The aspens had gone gold, and the highest peaks were already dusted white, and the smell coming down off the ridge in the mornings was clean and sharp, and carried a warning in it. Winter was not asking permission this year. That meant work, a lot of it, and fast. She had 2 contracts to fulfill before the first hard freeze, a set of cabinetry for the new schoolhouse going up on the eastern edge of town, and a custom door frame for Judge Vance's courthouse annex. Both required finish work that couldn't be rushed. Both required good light, which the short autumn days were already making stingy with. She'd been starting before sunrise and working until her hands cramped, and even then, the margin felt thin. When Jed came in that first Monday morning and asked what needed doing, she handed him a list without ceremony and went back to her own bench. He looked at the list, looked at the yard, looked at the list again. Then he put it in his breast pocket and started on the first item. He didn't ask her to explain things twice. When she showed him how she wanted the stock sorted by species first, then by cut, then by grade, he sorted it exactly that way, without shortcuts, without deciding his own system was better. She'd worked with men who couldn't manage that. Grown men, experienced men who heard instructions and then did it their own way anyway, because taking direction from a woman felt like a diminishment. Jed just did the work the way she asked for it. By the end of the first week, the yard was organized in a way she hadn't managed since the last full-time hand had quit in the spring. It felt almost strange to walk through it. Everything in its place, every stack square, the paths between the drying shed and the main bench clear and dry. She didn't tell him it was good, but she thought he probably knew, because on Friday afternoon she made enough coffee for 2 cups instead of 1, and he accepted his without comment. Small things. But small things were what a workshop ran on. The burn scar came into the story on a Tuesday. He'd been reaching across the secondary bench for a spoke shave when his sleeve slid up, and she saw the full length of it more than she'd clocked at the station. It ran from just above the wrist to nearly the inside of his elbow, the skin there, raised and rippled, red-brown fading to silver at the old edges. It was a serious scar, the kind that had taken months to heal and still had. She didn't look away fast enough. He noticed her noticing. He didn't pull his sleeve down. He just straightened and set the spoke shave on the bench. "Fire," he said. "I figured. Army camp. 5 years back." He turned his arm over and looked at it himself, briefly, with the expression of someone reading something they've memorized. "Ammunition cache caught. I got 3 men out before the fourth wall went." She was quiet for a moment. "You got 3 men out. Lost the use of the arm for about 6 months after. It came back." He flexed his hand, demonstrating full range, easy movement, mostly. "Does it hurt?" "Cold weather." She looked at the scar a moment longer. Then she went to the shelf where she kept the workshop supplies and came back with a small tin of salve beeswax and pine resin, and something her father's wife had taught her to make, good for dry skin and old injuries. She held it out. He looked at it. "It won't fix anything," she said, "but it helps with the cold stiffness. Keeps the skin from cracking." He took the tin, opened it, smelled it, seemed to approve of what he found there. He rubbed a small amount onto the scar tissue with his opposite hand, working it in slowly, and she turned back to her bench and let him have the privacy of it. "Thank you," he said, after a bit. "Keep it," she said. "I've got another." He did keep it. She saw it on the shelf above his cot, through the open door of the back quarters that evening. He'd set it there deliberately, within easy reach. That meant something, though she didn't examine too closely what. He asked her about her father. On a Wednesday, they were taking a midday break, sitting outside on the broad timber step in front of the workshop, eating the bread and cold cuts she'd packed. The sun was out but thin, the autumn light doing its best. Somewhere over the lumber yard, a hawk was working the updrafts without much effort. "Your father built all this himself?" Jed asked. He was looking at the yard, at the arrangement of it. "Started it." She broke a piece of bread. "He had the land and a handsaw and about $40 when he came out here. Built the first shed the first winter. Took him 3 years to get the mill up. When did he pass?" 4 years ago. Heart. She ate the bread. He held on long enough to see the yard turn its first real profit. Then he let go. "I think he'd been waiting for that." Jed nodded slowly. "He teach you the trade?" "He taught me everything I'd let him teach me, and then I went further." She said it, matter-of-factly, not prideful but accurate. "He was good with structure. I'm better with finish work." He knew it and he was glad of it, I think. He wanted the yard to outlast him. It will. She glanced at him. He was looking at the yard still, not at her. It will, he said again. You're not the kind of person who lets things fail. She didn't know what to do with that, so she ate more bread. After a moment, he said, "You know about Sterling? About Monty?" She was quiet. He was still alive when it happened. The wedding. She kept her voice even. He didn't say much about it. Mostly he came into the workshop the next morning and handed me a planer and said, "There's walnut needs flattening." That was probably the best thing anyone did for me that month. Jed was quiet. He didn't like Monty, she said. He was too polite to say so plainly, but he didn't like him. He had this way of going very still when Monty was around, like a horse that's caught a wrong smell in the air. She paused. I should have paid more attention to that. You were 21, Jed said, and you believed the man. That's not a character flaw. No, but it was expensive. She stood, brushing crumbs from her apron. Come on. I want to get the spokeshave work done before the light goes. He got up and followed her in without pushing the conversation further. She was grateful for that. He had a sense of when a subject had reached its natural stopping point, and he respected it. It was a rarer quality than people generally understood. The self-defense lesson happened because of the boot prints. She found them on Thursday morning outside the drying shed, along the east fence line. Boots with a narrow heel, walking slow, pausing at the fence for a while, and then turning back toward the road. Not a worker's boot, not someone with legitimate business. She showed Jed. He crouched and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he stood and looked at the fence line, following it with his eyes to where it met the road. Someone taking stock of the property, he said. I know. Could be Monty. Could be someone he sent. I know that too. He looked at her. You got a firearm? Colt revolver. My father's. I know how to use it. He nodded. All right. But in a close situation, a firearm's not always your first option. Range, reload time you might not have either. He looked around the yard. You know any hand-to-hand? She gave him a flat look. I'll take that as a no. He thought for a moment. I can show you some things. Army Scout basics. Nothing complicated. The point isn't to fight someone bigger than you. The point is to get enough space between you and them to have options. She crossed her arms. When now's fine. And so, in the middle of the lumber yard on a Thursday morning, with sawdust under their feet and the mountain wind coming down steady from the north, Jed Sterling showed Maeve Hollister how to break a grip. He was patient about it. Showed her the mechanics first, where pressure worked, where the human body was structurally weak, regardless of size. How to redirect force instead of opposing it. He was deliberate about explaining before demonstrating, and he demonstrated slowly, and he let her practice at full speed once she understood it. She caught on fast. She was strong, genuinely, practically strong, not just for a woman, but by any measure. And she had the kind of spatial intelligence that came from years of working in 3 dimensions. She understood leverage. She understood how weight transferred. After the 3rd repetition, she broke his grip cleanly and stepped back with 3 feet of space between them. Good, he said. Do it again, she said. They went another 40 minutes. By the end, she'd added an elbow release, a basic redirect from a grab at the collar, and what Jed called the last resort, a deliberate strike to a very specific point that he described with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to explain tool sharpening. She practiced that one twice. You're a fast learner, he said, rolling his sleeve back down. I had good motivation. She picked up her apron from the fence post where she'd hung it. Those prints worry me. They should. He pulled his hat back on. But now you've got more options than you did an hour ago. She tied her apron strings. What do Army Scouts do when someone's moving around the edges of their camp? They set a watch, he said. And they move their valuables. She looked at him. He looked at her. I'll take first watch tonight, he said. She nodded. Fireproof lockbox stays under the bench. The deed and survey papers are already in there. I'll get copies to Judge Vance tomorrow. Good plan. They went back to work. That afternoon, Vivian Sterling's carriage broke a wheel on the main street, directly in front of the lumber yard. Maeve heard it, the crack of the wheel rim, the sudden lurch of the carriage, the horse's alarmed sound. She came out of the workshop and saw the carriage tilted at a hard angle on the street, one rear wheel split clean in half, and Vivian Sterling sitting inside with her white-gloved hands pressed flat on her knees, very still, very composed, in the deliberate way of a person composing themselves after a fright. The driver was already down and swearing at the wheel. He didn't seem inclined to help his passenger. Maeve stood in the doorway for half a second. Then she walked out. She went to the carriage door and opened it. "Are you hurt?" Vivian looked at her. Up close, she was younger than Maeve had assumed at the station, maybe 25, not much older than Maeve herself. Her eyes were a pale gray, and there were shadows under them that face powder hadn't quite covered. "I'm fine," Vivian said. It was the kind of fine that meant she'd been asked that question in difficult circumstances, often enough to have a ready answer for it. The ground's uneven where you'd step down. Here, Maeve held out her hand. A pause. Brief, but visible. Then Vivienne took it and stepped down. She was steadier than Maeve expected. She stood and assessed the wheel without flinching, the way someone accustomed to managing practical problems did. Can it be repaired? Not today. Maeve looked at the split. The rim's clean through. You need a new wheel, and that means the wheelwright on the south end, and he's got at least a day's backlog. She looked at Vivienne. "Where are you trying to get to?" "The hotel. I can have someone drive you in the yard cart. It's not a carriage, but it gets where it's going." Another pause. This one was the kind where someone was deciding whether to accept help from a person they'd been positioned to see as an adversary. "That's very kind," Vivienne said finally. Her voice had dropped the high social polish just slightly. What was underneath it was quieter and more careful. Maeve called back to the yard where Jed was working the fence post. "Jed, can you drive Mrs. Sterling to the hotel?" He appeared in the gateway, glanced at the situation, nodded once, and went for the cart without needing further explanation. Vivienne watched him go. Then she looked at Maeve. "You don't have any reason to help me." "I don't have any reason not to," Maeve said. She meant it simply. Vivienne looked at her for a moment, a careful, assessing look that seemed to weigh something. "Montgomery speaks of you often," she said. "His characterization is not favorable. I know what his characterization is." "Yes." A pause. "I imagine you do." Jed brought the cart around. He helped Vivian up with a brief, practiced steadiness, not elaborate, just sufficient. Vivienne settled onto the seat and smoothed her skirt. She looked back at Maeve from the cart. "You're not what I expected," she said. Maeve held her gaze. "Neither are you." Something moved through Vivian's face, just briefly. Something that looked, under all that careful composure, like a woman who'd been told a great many things about herself, and was quietly starting to wonder which of them were true. Then Jed clicked to the horse, and the cart moved off down the street. Maeve watched it go. She stood there in the afternoon light for a moment, thinking. She didn't know what Vivian Sterling's full situation was, but she knew what shadows under the eyes meant when face powder couldn't cover them. She knew what the particular quality of that kind of stillness meant, the stillness that wasn't peace but control, the kind you maintained when you were always on the edge of something going wrong. She'd seen it before. Not in the mirror, but she'd seen it. She went back inside. When Jed returned from the hotel, he didn't say anything about the interaction, just came back to the fence post work without fanfare. She was at the hand plane, working the walnut cabinet door, pulling long, clean strokes that she could do half in her sleep. "She ask you anything?" Maeve said. "About the yard," Jed said. He was resetting the post with a mallet, steady, measured blows. "About how long we'd been together." "I said 3 weeks. She believe you?" He seemed to consider this. She's too smart not to notice it was a short answer, but she didn't push. "She's smart," Maeve agreed, "smarter than he deserves." Jed said nothing to that, which meant he agreed, probably. She kept planing. The walnut gave under the blade in satisfying curls, the grain opening up clean and even. Her father had always said walnut was the most honest wood. It didn't pretend to be easier than it was, and it rewarded patience with a beauty nothing else quite matched. She thought about Vivian's face when she'd said, "You're not what I expected." She thought about the way Vivian's gloved hand had held hers as she stepped down from the tilted carriage firm. Not fragile, the grip of someone who'd learned to hold on. She thought about Monty at the station. That smile. The way he spoke to people like they existed, mostly for his use. She thought about those boot prints along the east fence line. There were pieces here that she couldn't see the whole shape of yet. She'd been in the workshop long enough to know that when you couldn't see the whole shape of something, the answer was to slow down, look at each piece separately, and trust that the grain of the thing would eventually tell you which way it was going to move. She kept planing. Outside, Jed finished the fence post and moved on to the next one. She could hear the steady thud of the mallet through the workshop wall, regular as a clock, reliable as weather. The cabinet door was coming out beautifully. The walnut grain ran clean and long, and the hand plane left a surface that caught the light like still water. She ran her thumb down it to check smooth everywhere. No ridges, no tracking marks. Her father would have liked it. She set it aside to dry and picked up the next piece. That night, past 9 o'clock, she was still working by lamplight when she heard Jed come in from his watch. He moved quietly through the workshop to the back quarters, stopped at the door. "Nothing on the east fence tonight," he said. "All right." She was fitting mortises and didn't look up. "Go to sleep. You should too, when I'm done with this joint." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the cabinet work, spread across the bench, the walnut panels, the fitted corners, the small, carefully carved detail on the frame edge. That wasn't in the contract, but that she'd put there because the school children would be using these cabinets, and she thought they deserved something beautiful. "What's the carving?" he asked. She glanced at it. "Pine branch. My father used to put a small one on everything he built. I kept the habit." Jed looked at it for a moment in the lamplight. "Good habit. Go to sleep, Jed." He went. She heard the door to the back quarters close softly, and then the workshop was quiet again except for the wind and the lamp flame and the small, precise sounds of mallet and chisel. She worked another 40 minutes. When she finally put down her tools, she looked at the day's work on the bench. The cabinet panels, the fitted joints, the clean walnut grain catching the lamp's amber light, the pine branch carving, small and careful, pressed into the corner of the frame where a child's hand might someday find it. Her hands were pine resin, stained and calloused, and a little sore at the right knuckle from where she'd been gripping the chisel. She looked at them for a moment. She thought about what Jed had said over her supper plate 4 days ago. Firm and plainly meant, no particular ceremony to it. Your body needs fuel to build masterpieces. She thought about the boot prints on the east fence, about Monty at the land office asking about survey records, about Vivian's careful gray eyes, about the signed agreement on the corner of the bench, 2 names side by side. She blew out the lamp. She climbed the stairs in the dark, knowing every step by feel, and she lay down and pulled the quilt up and listened to the mountain wind move through the pines. 1 month. She still had 3 weeks left on the contract. She fell asleep thinking about walnut grain and burn scars and the particular steadiness of a man who could hold a 12-foot beam and then tell you to eat your dinner. And she slept soundly, and the east fence line stayed quiet all night long. The harvest dance was Oakhaven's one real vanity. Every other civic event in town was practical: the spring planting auction, the summer freight fair, the autumn cattle count. But the harvest dance was pure celebration, and the town went at it seriously. The Grange Hall got swept out and hung with dried corn and orange lanterns. Someone always hauled in a fiddle player from up the valley and another from down it, and they'd argue good-naturedly about tempo all night, while the floor filled up, and the arguments stopped mattering. Maeve had gone every year since she was a girl. She'd gone the year her father died. She'd gone the year after Monty left, which had been the hardest, because half the room had looked at her with that particular careful pity that was almost worse than cruelty. She'd danced with Mrs. Miller's nephew that year, out of pure stubbornness, and she'd held her chin level the whole night. She was going this year, too. She'd decided that before the situation, with Jed, before Monty came back, before any of it, she was going because she went. That was the whole reason. The dress was a different matter. It had arrived from the dressmaker 3 days before the dance, and when Maeve unwrapped it on her bed, she stood there for a full minute, just looking at it. She'd commissioned it back in August, before the world got complicated, and the dressmaker, a practical Hungarian woman named Mrs. Borek, who had no patience for fashion nonsense, had done exactly what Maeve asked. Deep burgundy wool, fitted through the bodice and waist, full skirt, with enough room to move. No pinching, no engineering, no pretending. It was made for the body Maeve actually had, and it was made well. She tried it on alone, with the door latched. The mirror in her room was small and slightly warped. It had been her father's, and he hadn't much for mirrors. She turned in it as best she could. Mrs. Borek had done good work. The wool lay smooth over her shoulders and waist and hips, the burgundy color warm against her skin. She looked like herself, a dressed-up version, a polished version, but herself. She stood there a moment longer than she meant to. Then she unlatched the door, went back to the workshop, and did not think about it again until the evening of the dance. Jed knocked on the stairwell door at 6:30. "Ready when you are," he said through the door. 2 minutes. She came down 3 minutes later, pulling on her coat. She'd put her hair up pinned rather than elaborate, because elaborate was not her, and she had her good boots on, the ones she reserved for ground that wasn't a work yard. Jed was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He'd cleaned up. She noticed that first his hair brushed back, his shirt pressed, a jacket she hadn't seen before, that fit him well across the shoulders. He'd shaved, which changed the geometry of his face slightly, made him look younger, and at the same time, somehow more formal. He looked at her when she came down. He looked for a moment that ran just slightly past polite. Then he straightened. "You look fine," he said. Coming from Jed, she'd come to understand that meant exactly what it said, and also something more. He didn't scatter compliments. Every word he put down was one he'd weighed. "Thank you," she said. "You don't look terrible." Something at the corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "Let's go." They walked to the Grange Hall together. The night was cold and clear, the sky enormous above the mountain line, so many stars it looked almost artificial. Their breath made small clouds. Their boots crunched on the frost-stiff road. They didn't talk much on the walk over. That was all right. She'd stopped filling silences around Jed sometime in the past week. The silences with him were just quiet, not loaded or awkward, just two people moving through the same air. The Grange Hall was already bright and loud when they arrived. Lantern light poured from the high windows. The fiddles were going, a reel that was just fast enough to require real attention. And through the open door, she could see the floor already crowded with people. Mrs. Miller appeared at the entrance with a cup of cider and handed it to Maeve without preamble. She looked Jed up and down with the calm assessment of a woman who had seen everything this territory could produce. "Sterling," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "You dance?" "Passably." "That'll do." She turned back to Maeve with an expression that communicated several paragraphs worth of opinion in about a quarter second, then disappeared back into the crowd before Maeve could respond to any of it. They went inside. Maeve saw Monty within 3 minutes of arriving. He was across the room, already positioned near the center. Where people could see him, he'd always had that instinct, placing himself where the light was best. Vivienne was beside him in a pale green gown, standing very straight, her smile fixed at the precise calibration required for public presentation. The two city men Maeve had seen him with at the land office were nearby, conspicuously out of place among Oakhaven's working crowd. Monty saw Maeve at the same moment she saw him. His eyes moved over her and then moved to Jed, and stayed there a beat too long. Then he smiled that constructed smile, wide and comfortable, and turned back to his conversation. Maeve accepted a second cup of cider from a passing tray. He clocked us, Jed said quietly, beside her. I know he's got those two men from the land office with him. I see them. Want to move further in? She looked at the dance floor. The reel had ended, and the fiddles were starting something slower, a waltz tempo. The floor was reshuffling, couples finding each other, older folks moving to the edges where the chairs were. Yes, she said. Let's dance. She held out her hand. He looked at it for just a second, and she saw him make the small internal calculation they'd agreed. To make this look real, and making it look real meant making it look easy. He took her hand. His hand was calloused and warm, and held hers firmly without gripping. He led her to the floor with no ceremony, and turned her to face him. They found the rhythm together in the first 4 bars. He was, as he'd told Mrs. Miller, passable, but passable undersold it. He had the kind of dancing that came from a man who'd learned in practical circumstances, army posts and frontier socials, and places where dancing was an actual communal necessity rather than a performance. And that meant he was solid on his feet and present, and he didn't crowd her. He gave her room to move. He followed the music rather than fighting it. She was better than passable. She'd always been a natural dancer, which surprised people who assumed that her size meant something about her coordination. It didn't. She could move, and she knew it. And on a dance floor she let herself move without apologizing for it. Together, they were better than either of them separately. She felt it in the first full turn, the way the music settled into their shared movement, the ease of it. She'd danced with partners before who made her feel like a problem to be managed through a song. Jed just danced. He paid attention, adjusted, made space. It was like working timber with someone who actually understood wood. The difference between fighting the material and working with it was enormous. The room kept moving around them. She was aware of eyes peripherally. Oakhaven always watched. That was the nature of Oakhaven, but the eyes felt different than they had last year. Last year, they'd been careful eyes, pitying eyes. This year, they were curious, interested. Some of them were smiling. Mrs. Miller, from her chair by the wall, was definitely smiling. They danced through 2 full songs without stopping. By the second one, the conversation around the floor had changed in that subtle social way. People were watching them with the kind of attention that meant they were seeing something worth watching, not cataloging something worth gossiping over. There was a difference, and Maeve felt it. She also felt Monty's eyes on her from across the room. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. When the second song ended, Jed stepped back and released her hand cleanly. No lingering, just the movement of 2 people who'd found a working rhythm and then stopped when the music stopped. You can really dance, he said. So can you, for a man who said passably. I was managing expectations. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. Exactly. It just came out. He looked surprised by it, briefly, and then he looked like a man filing something away. They moved to the side of the floor and took water from the table, and Maeve felt the warmth of the exertion in her face and her hands, and was aware that she was genuinely enjoying herself, which she hadn't fully expected. Across the room, Vivienne was watching her. Not the way Monty watched with calculation in it. Vivienne watched like someone studying a question she couldn't quite figure out how to ask. Maeve held her gaze briefly, honestly, and then looked away. Not coldly, just giving her the room to make of it what she would. Monty made his move around 9 o'clock. He cut across the room with his 2 city men flanking him at a distance, and he had his social voice on the warm one. The reasonable one, the one that sounded like it was doing you a favor. Maeve. He nodded to her, and then to Jed, with the minimal acknowledgement of someone who has decided to be magnanimous. Quite a performance on the floor tonight. We were just dancing, Monty. Of course, he smiled. You know, I've been thinking. Now that I'm back in Oakhaven with serious resources at my disposal, I'd love to help you with the yard. The operation your father built was admirable. But the market's changing. A woman managing a lumber concern alone she's not alone, Jed said. Monty glanced at him. Yes, so I see. Regardless, my offer stands, Maeve. I can connect you with investors who would give you fair market for the land. Take the capital. Start something smaller, something more. He paused with practiced care. Manageable. Maeve looked at him. She was very calm. She'd been calm for the whole conversation because she'd seen it coming from the moment he crossed the room, and she'd had time to set her feet. I've managed that yard through a drought, a price collapse, and a winter that killed 3 other operations on this territory, she said, without help from anyone holding your particular variety of resources. So the answer is no, Monty. It'll stay no, you can stop asking. The smile stayed on his face, but it got quieter underneath. Suit yourself. Though I'd think carefully, Maeve. Some opportunities don't come around twice. That's my hope, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his right back. And then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, his 2 men falling in beside him. Jed said nothing. He'd said his one line, and then stepped back, which was exactly right. She hadn't needed a rescuer. She'd needed someone standing beside her so that Monty couldn't position her as isolated, and that was what Jed had been. She appreciated the difference. She appreciated that he understood the difference. Another dance? She said. When you're ready, he said. They went back to the floor. They left the dance at 10:30. The walk home was colder than the walk over, the frost heavier now, and the stars had been partly swallowed by cloud coming in from the northwest. The wind had picked up. Maeve could smell pine on it, and something else, something dry and sharp. She almost said something about it. She didn't. They came around the corner to the yard, and Jed stopped walking first. She stopped beside him. The lumber yard was wrong. She felt it before she saw it, a quality of the darkness that was off. A faint color at the edge of the drying shed that shouldn't have been there. Orange at the bottom. Alive. Fire, Jed said, and then they were both running. The drying shed was at the back of the yard, farthest from the road, and by the time they cleared the main gate, the fire had already found its enthusiasm. The base of the shed's east wall was going well, dry timber catching in the way dried timber catches, fast and completely, and without negotiation. The stack of freshly cured boards inside was a month's income at minimum, and behind the shed was a lean-to structure that connected to the main workshop. And if the fire got there, the blueprints, Maeve said. The blueprints were in the workshop. Her father's original survey drawings, the design documents, the signed patents for the joinery methods she'd developed. They were in the fireproof lockbox, but the lockbox was bolted to the secondary bench, and if the workshop caught, she didn't know if it would be enough. She went for the main workshop door. Her hand found the mallet hanging by the entry, her father's, a great solid piece of hickory and iron that she kept there out of habit, and she looked at the door and saw the padlock she'd put on it last week when Jed had found the boot prints, and she'd locked it, and the key was in her coat pocket, and she had it out in 2 seconds, but the lock was stiff from the cold, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the hard run and the cold air, and it took 4 seconds longer than it should have. The lock opened. She pushed the door and went in. The workshop smelled of smoke, but wasn't on fire yet. The east wall was warm to the touch when she pressed her palm against it. Not alarmingly hot, but warm. The fire was getting close. She went straight to the secondary bench. The lockbox was there, solid, the bolt fitting flush with the floor bracket. She got her keys out again, smaller key this time, and opened it, and pulled out the survey maps and the patent documents and the deed and the photographs her father had taken of the original site, rolled in their oilcloth, and she stuffed them under her arm and turned for the door. Jed was coming in from outside. He moved past her, toward the east wall, toward the lean-to connection where the fire was closest, and she understood what he was doing. He was going to check if the fire had gotten into the connecting structure, whether they had time or whether they needed to get the stock out now. Jed, the wall she started. He was already at the connection point, pulling the boards apart with his hands to see the gap, and the fire had gotten into the eave above it. She could see it from where she stood, a tongue of orange licking down through the old timber, and it dropped. A burning piece of it dropped directly onto his arm, the left one, the scarred one, and he put it out in 2 seconds with his opposite hand and didn't make a sound, but she saw his jaw set hard. She was across the workshop in 4 steps. She got her hand around his good arm and pulled him back from the wall, and they went out the workshop door together, into the cold night air, and she pulled the door shut behind them, her documents still clutched under her arm. Outside, Jed pressed his right hand over his left forearm. She could see, through the scorched fabric, that the burn had landed directly on the old scar tissue. New injury on old injury. That was bad. Let me see, she said. Let me see, Jed. He held out his arm. She pushed the scorched sleeve up carefully. The burn was real, a fresh mark, angry and red, laid right across the old silver-pink scar tissue. It needed cold water and salve and wrapping, and it needed it soon. Come on. She kept her grip on his arm, guiding him toward the yard pump. Behind them, the sound of voices, the neighbors from the street, alerted by the smoke, and someone had clearly gone for help, because she could hear shouting from the direction of the main street. Oak Haven looked after its own. That was one true thing about the place. She pumped cold water over his arm, and he held still for it, his face tight but controlled. She kept her hand on his arm and counted seconds and let the water run. "The blueprints?" he said, looking at the documents under her arm. "Got them?" He exhaled. "Good. The shed's going to be a loss," she said. The shed was fully lit now, the orange light, enormous against the dark sky, throwing shadows across the whole yard. But the workshop was still standing. The main stockpiles were far enough from the shed that if the fire team got here in the next 10 minutes, they'd hold. She could hear them coming. She could hear the iron wheels of the fire cart on the road. "You saved them," Jed said. "You saved the workshop wall," she said. "You kept the fire from jumping the connection. I had help." He glanced down at where her hand was still on his arm. She didn't let go immediately. She held a moment longer, looking at the fresh burn on the old scar, and she felt a cold, specific fury building behind her sternum. Not panic, not grief. Fury, clean and quiet and pointing in a very clear direction. This was not an accident. She knew it the way she knew grain direction in timber. You developed a sense for it after enough years, and it didn't lie to you. Someone had set this fire. The boot prints on the east fence had been reconnaissance. Tonight was the result. She looked at the burning shed. She looked at the documents tucked under her arm. She looked at Jed's arm, under her hand. Every human soul has a right to stand tall and protect their hard work, Jed said quietly. She looked at him. His voice was low and even, the same steadiness he brought to everything, but there was something underneath it, something with weight. Never bow your head to someone trying to burn down your dreams. She held his gaze. The fire cart came through the gate. Men poured in with buckets and the hand pump, moving fast and organized, and Mrs. Miller arrived 2 minutes later without any apparent explanation for how she'd gotten there that fast, and she immediately took Jed's arm and began directing Maeve to fetch her supply kit from the cart, and the controlled chaos of it took over. Maeve went. She moved through the next hour on the clear mechanical energy that comes when you've moved past fear and arrived somewhere more functional. She held the lamp so the fire crew could see. She answered questions from the team leader about where the other water sources were. She moved stock that was close to the heat zone, lifting the heavy pieces herself, not waiting to be helped. Her good dress be damned. The workshop held. The fire took the shed and spared everything else. By midnight, the fire was out, and the yard smelled of smoke and wet timber and cold ash, and Mrs. Miller had wrapped Jed's arm properly with strips of clean linen, and the burn salve Maeve had retrieved from the workshop shelf the same tin she'd given him for the old scar, the one he'd kept within reach above his cot. She sat on the bench outside the workshop door, the patent documents in her lap, her coat over her shoulders. The yard was quiet now. Most of the people had gone home. Mrs. Miller was inside making coffee with the workshop stove because she'd decided to, and nobody had argued with her. Jed came and sat on the bench beside her. His arm was wrapped to the elbow. He moved carefully with it, the deliberate movement of someone managing an injury without making theater of it. He sat and looked at the ruined shed, the charred skeleton of it still smoking faintly in the cold air. "It was arson," she said. "Yes, Monty. Can't prove it tonight." His voice was steady. "But yes." She looked down at the documents in her lap. The oilcloth had protected them perfectly. Every page intact. Her father's handwriting on the original survey, her own on the patents, the deed with the county seal still crisp and legible. "He thought he could scare me off," she said, "or destroy the evidence of my claim, or both." Jed looked at her. The coal oil lantern by the door lit the right side of his face, the weathered angles of it, the steadiness in his eyes. "He doesn't know you," he said. She almost smiled. "No, he never did." The coffee smell came from inside the workshop, and Mrs. Miller appeared in the doorway with 2 cups, handed them over without comment, looked at them both with an expression that contained volumes, and went back inside. Maeve wrapped her hands around the cup. The smoke was settling. The cold was thorough and real, and she was going to feel this night in her body tomorrow. The run, the lifting, the grip on Jed's arm over the cold pump water. But right now, sitting on the bench outside her damaged yard with her father's blueprints in her lap, and the workshop standing behind her, and her name still on the deed, and the deed still in her hands, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Resolved, not beaten, not diminished, not standing in a wedding dress in front of people watching her be abandoned. Resolved, she would go to Judge Vance in the morning. She would take the documents. She would find out what Monty was building legally, and she would build something back. She would talk to every person in this territory who had ever worked with her and known her fairly, and treated her fairly in return. She looked sideways at Jed. He was looking at the ruined shed, his wrapped arm resting across his knees, his coffee cup in his other hand. He looked tired. The burn under the bandage had to hurt considerably. He hadn't said so. Once, "You should sleep," she said. "So should you. I'm going to sit here a while longer." He didn't argue. He sat with her. That was all. He just stayed. The cold deepened, and the smoke thinned, and the stars came back out in patches where the clouds broke apart overhead, and they sat on the bench outside the workshop that was still standing, and the night moved around them, and Oakhaven was quiet. After a long time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more, Jed said, "You're going to rebuild that shed better than it was." She looked at the charred frame. "Yes," she said. "I am," she would. She already knew the design longer than the old one, better ventilated, the drying capacity doubled. She'd been thinking about it for 2 years and just hadn't had cause to act. Well, now she had cause. She picked up her father's documents and held them against her chest. In the morning, she would start making things right. Tonight, she had her workshop, her documents, and coffee. That was still hot. She drank it. Jed sat beside her and didn't say anything else. And that was the right thing, and she knew it. And somewhere underneath the smell of ash and cold pine air, the night was very still, and the mountains were enormous and permanent and indifferent to the small human dramas happening at their feet, which was, Maeve thought, actually a comfort. She went inside just before 1 o'clock. She slept in her work clothes, with the oilcloth documents on the table beside her bed, and she slept without dreams. The days after the fire had a particular texture to them, ash smell that didn't fully leave, even after the rain came through and washed the yard. The charred skeleton of the drying shed standing at the back of the property, like a bad memory that hadn't decided to leave yet. Maeve had covered the remaining stock under canvas tarps and rerouted her drying process through the main workshop, which made the space tighter and the work slower, and she absorbed both of those facts without complaint and kept moving. She filed a report with the sheriff's office the morning after the fire. Sheriff Calbriggs took her statement with the careful blankness of a man who had already decided how much attention to give a thing. He wrote what she said. He read it back. He told her he'd look into it. She didn't trust him. She hadn't trusted him in a general way for 2 years, for no reason she could have named precisely, except that he was the kind of man who made you feel like he was calculating something when he looked at you. Now she trusted him less specifically, because she'd seen the way his eyes had moved to the hotel at the end of the street when she said the word arson. Just briefly, just once. But she wrote it down that she'd noticed, in her own ledger, at home, where nobody else was going to read it. She went to Judge Vance's office that same morning with the registered copies of her deed and patent documents, and Vance took them and logged them without ceremony and looked at her over his reading glasses with the mild, observant expression of a man who had been on this territory long enough to recognize a pattern forming. "You think this is going to become a legal matter," he said. "I think someone is trying to make it one," she said. "I want to be ahead of it." Vance nodded slowly. He was 60-something, lean and deliberate, with a reputation for reading the law the way a careful man read a map, attending to every mark on it, not just the ones that pointed where he wanted to go. "I'll keep these filed under formal record," he said. "If anything comes to court, you'll have prior registration." "Thank you, Judge, Miss Hollister." He set his glasses down. "Be careful," she told him she would be. She mostly meant it. Jed's arm healed with the stubbornness of a man who didn't give injuries much authority over his schedule. He kept the wrapping on for 4 days and then removed it himself and inspected the burn with the same expression he used for checking tack thorough, unemotional, looking for information. The new burn had settled into the old scar tissue in a way that was, according to Mrs. Miller, who had looked at it twice, better than it had any right to be. The skin was angry but unbroken. He had full use of the hand. He rebuilt the drying shed frame himself, starting on day 3. Maeve hadn't asked him to. She'd been planning to hire it out once her cash position recovered, but she came out one morning and found him in the yard with a chalk line and a measuring rod, laying out the new footprint on the cleared ground. She stood in the doorway and looked at what he was doing. "You're making it bigger," she said. "You said you wanted more capacity." He didn't look up from the chalk line. "North wall moves out 12 feet. You get 40% more floor space. Venting on the ridge will need to account for it." She had said that. She'd said it sitting on the bench on the night of the fire, almost to herself, and she thought he might have been half asleep by then. She went back inside and got her own measuring rod. They worked the layout together, and she moved the north wall out 14 feet instead of 12, because if she was rebuilding right, and Jed adjusted the chalk line without comment, and they staked the corners, and she drew the full design that afternoon with proper venting calculations. And it was a better shed than the one she'd had before, and she felt the cold, particular satisfaction of turning a loss into an improvement. She felt other things, too, during those days. Things she was more careful with. She was aware of him in the workshop in a way that had shifted. It had happened gradually, and then, after the fire, all at once. When he moved across the space to reach a tool, she was aware of where he was. When he handed her something, a clamp, a board, a cup of water, their hands were close, and she noticed. When he sat at the bench in the evening, cleaning tack or reading, which he did sometimes, one of the 3 books he'd brought in his saddlebag. She found herself tracking the peripheral fact of him, the way you tracked peripheral sound in a dark workshop instinctively, without deciding to. She didn't examine it closely. She had a business arrangement, and a threat to her land, and a shed to rebuild. She kept working. The gossip in town had reached a new pitch. She heard it from Mrs. Miller, who heard everything, and filtered it with the efficiency of a woman who had been at the center of Oakhaven's social nervous system for 30 years. The word going around was that Monty Sterling had serious railroad money behind him, that a line was coming through the territory, that certain land parcels were going to be very valuable very soon, and that Montgomery Sterling, who was being quietly presented to people as a returning son with Eastern capital and the territory's development interests at heart, had already identified the key parcels. The name Hollister came up in those conversations. She didn't hear it directly. She heard the shape of it, the pause where the name would be. She told Jed what she'd heard over supper on a Wednesday, and he listened without interrupting, and then was quiet for a moment. Railroad land, he said. That's what she's hearing. A line through this valley would need to come through the northern corridor. He drew an invisible line on the workbench with one finger. Your land sits right in the middle of it. She'd looked at maps since she was old enough to read them. She knew her land's position. She'd just never thought of it as a liability before. That's why he came back, she said. That's why he came back. Jed agreed. She ate the rest of her supper in silence. Her hands were steady. Her mind was working. 3 days before the month was up on their agreement, Vivian Sterling came to the yard at midnight in the rain. Maeve heard the knock, first 3 raps, hesitant on the workshop side door that faced the alley rather than the street. She'd been awake anyway. She'd been lying upstairs listening to the rain on the roof and thinking about the deed and the railroad and the sheriff's empty expression when she'd said the word arson. She came downstairs with the lamp. Through the small window beside the door, she could see a figure in a dark cloak, hood up, standing close to the wall where the eave gave some shelter from the rain. She opened the door. Vivian stepped inside quickly, pulling her hood down. Her hair was damp at the edges. She was breathing fast, not from running from the controlled effort of someone who had been holding themselves tightly together for a period of time and was approaching the limit of it. She looked around the workshop at the tools, the work in progress, the lamplight, Maeve standing in her work coat with her hair down. I'm sorry, Vivian said. For the hour? Sit down, Maeve said. She moved the stool from beside the secondary bench and set it near the small stove that was keeping the workshop warm against the autumn chill. You want coffee? No. Vivian sat. She pressed her hands together in her lap. I don't have much time. I told the hotel I needed air, that I was going to the covered porch. She paused. He checks. When he thinks I've been out long. Maeve set the lamp on the bench and sat on the bench edge across from her. She waited. Vivian looked at the stove for a moment. The rain was heavy on the roof. Outside, the alley was dark and empty. There is a railroad syndicate, Vivian said, out of Chicago. They've been in correspondence with Montgomery for 8 months. The line they're planning will run directly through this valley, through the northern corridor. Her voice was even, precise, the voice of someone who had memorized what they needed to say. Your land, Miss Hollister. It sits at the center of the projected route. Maeve said nothing. She kept her face still. The syndicate's offer for the parcel would represent a substantial sum, more than the yard earns in several years. Vivian paused. Montgomery receives a finder's commission for each parcel he delivers. He needs it. He is. He has been telling people he has capital. He does not. Her jaw tightened. He has debt. Considerable debt from failed ventures in Philadelphia and before that in Baltimore. The coat and the hotel room are borrowed presentation. He's broke, Maeve said, flatly. Vivian looked at her. The arson was his. He has no direct connection to it. He hired it. But I have seen the letter. The arrangement was written down, which is the sort of error he makes when he is confident that no one around him will act against him. A pause. He has been confident of that for a long time. The rain came down. Harder. The stove ticked. "Why are you telling me this?" Maeve asked. Vivian held her gaze. "Because you helped me when my carriage broke. You had no reason to, and you did it anyway." She looked down at her hands. "Because I have been watching you from the hotel window for 3 weeks, and I have seen a woman running a business and protecting what her father built and standing up in public with her chin level, and I have thought several times that I cannot remember the last time I did any of those things." Her voice didn't waver, but it was thinner than it had been. "And because he is going to do worse than the fire if you don't move first. He has spoken to the sheriff. Briggs is in his pocket. He's been paid." Maeve was very still. "He will find a legal mechanism," Vivian continued. "He already has someone working on it, a lawyer in Portland, who specializes in property disputes under frontier statutes. The argument will be something about prior claim or survey error, or debt against the estate. It won't be true, but it will be complicated enough to take time, and time is what he needs. Time for what? Time for you to become tired enough, or scared enough, or financially strained enough to sell." Vivian looked at her steadily. "That is his method. He does not fight directly. He applies pressure from enough directions that eventually the person he's targeting believes they are being squeezed by the world rather than by him specifically." Maeve thought about the sheriff's careful blankness. The boot prints on the east fence. The city men at the harvest dance. The fire that had taken her shed, and was meant probably to take more. She thought about Monty's smile at the station that first day. She's still so alone. She'd been meant to feel isolated. She understood that now, seeing the full shape of it. The gossip, the fire, the legal pressure building, all of it designed to make her feel like she was standing in a narrowing space with nowhere to go, and no one beside her. She looked at Vivienne. "The letter," Maeve said. "The one arranging the arson. Where is it?" "In his leather document case, the one he keeps locked in the hotel room safe." Vivienne opened her cloak and drew out a folded paper. "I cannot bring you the original, but I copied it, by hand tonight, while he was at dinner." She held it out. Maeve took it. She unfolded it and read it in the lamplight. The handwriting was careful and clear, Vivian's hand, copying Monty's. The words were specific enough to be damning. A sum, a date, an instruction about the eastern wall of the Hollister drying shed, a name she didn't recognize, whoever he'd hired. It was enough for Judge Vance, maybe enough for a territorial court. She folded it and held it. "He'll know you did this," she said. "Eventually." Vivienne pulled her cloak back together. "I've been thinking about eventually for 2 years, Miss Hollister. I've been thinking about what eventually looks like and whether I'm willing to keep waiting for it." She stood from the stool. "I am not as frightened of eventually as I used to be." Maeve looked at her. "Where will you go? When things come apart." "My aunt in Cincinnati. I have written to her." Vivian's voice was careful. "She has a house and a garden, and she has told me I am welcome. Montgomery does not know she exists." "Good." Maeve stood. "Stay in contact with me. Use Mrs. Miller at the diner. She can receive messages for you without it looking like anything. Anything you need, if I can provide it, I will." Vivienne looked at her for a moment with those pale gray eyes, and Maeve saw it again, the thing she'd seen at the carriage. The quality of a woman who was in the process of remembering what she was capable of. "Thank you," Vivienne said. "You came out in the rain at midnight," Maeve said. "That took courage." Vivienne pulled her hood up. "So does what you're going to do next." She slipped out the side door and into the alley, and the rain swallowed her. Maeve stood in the workshop with the copied letter in her hand and listened to the rain on the roof. She was still standing there when the back quarters door opened and Jed came out. He'd heard the knock, she realized. He'd waited, and now he'd heard the door close. He stood in the doorway in his boots and his untucked shirt, his wrapped arm at his side, looking at her. "Vivian Sterling, Maeve said. She came to warn me. She told him all of it. She told him quickly and cleanly. The way she gave work instructions, no unnecessary language. Just the facts in the right order. The railroad, Monty's debt, the arson letter, Briggs on Monty's payroll. Jed listened the way he always listened. Completely, and without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "We need to move tonight," he said. "The document's already with Vance. And the copies. The letter goes to Vance first thing. At first light." She set the folded paper on the bench. "Jed, if Briggs is paid, then we can't use the sheriff's office for anything." He was already thinking ahead. Vance is outside Briggs's jurisdiction. A territorial magistrate outranks a county sheriff, especially in a property matter. He paused. "I know a man in the land office. Decent man. He's noticed Monty's inquiry pattern, and he doesn't like it. If we can get him to pull the formal inquiry records and cross-reference with the railroad syndicate correspondence." A sound, not from inside. From outside, from the street side of the workshop, the main approach. They both went still. Maeve's eyes moved to the window. The street was dark and rain-sheeted, visibility poor, but she could see shapes. Figures on horses, lanterns held low. More than two. She counted 4 horses, maybe 5. Jed moved to the window beside her, looked, and stepped back. "Get the revolver?" he said quietly. She was already moving for the shelf. The sound of boots on the workshop steps came before she reached it. Heavy boots, official in their weight and spacing. Then a fist on the door. "Open up. Sheriff's business." She and Jed looked at each other. He gave her one small nod, an honest nod. Not reassuring, just clear. They both knew what this was. She opened the door. Sheriff Briggs stood on the step with 2 deputies behind him and 2 more in the yard. He was in his official coat, water running off the brim of his hat. He had papers in his hand. He looked at Maeve, and he looked at Jed, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been told to do something, and had decided to be very official while doing it. "Jedediah Sterling," Briggs said. Jed said nothing. "I have here a federal warrant issued out of the Portland Circuit office." Briggs held up the papers. "Charges of bank robbery and treason. Warrant dates to March 1873. He looked past Maeve at Jed. "Step out, Sterling." Maeve's jaw tightened. She stood in the doorway and didn't move. "That warrant is 5 years old," she said. "On what basis?" "Miss Hollister." Briggs's voice was flat. "Stand aside." "On what basis is a 5-year-old federal warrant being served tonight, in the rain, by a county sheriff? Stand aside." Jed put a hand on her shoulder. Gentle, brief. She turned and looked at him. His face was quiet, calmer than she could account for, given what was happening. He held her gaze, and she saw something in his expression that was not resignation, it was something else, something older and more prepared, like a man who had known a particular weather was coming and had been watching the horizon for it for a long time. He stepped past her and out onto the workshop step. The deputies moved in immediately, and Briggs produced iron shackles, not rope, not cuffs, iron shackles on a short chain, and Jed put his hands out in front of him, and the iron went on. She watched the shackles close around his wrists. "This warrant is fabricated," she said. Her voice came out even. She was working very hard to keep it that way. "I will be at Judge Vance's office at first light." Briggs didn't respond to that. He was looking at Jed. The rain was full and cold. The lanterns in the yard threw long shaking shadows across the ground, across the space where the burned shed used to stand. Jed's hands were in iron, and the deputies were at his shoulders, and the whole picture was wrong, deeply wrong, and she was calculating, even as she looked at Vance, the letter, the land office contact, how fast she could move, what she needed to have in hand before morning. Then Jed turned his head and looked at her. The lantern light caught his face, wet with rain, and he looked at her with those steady dark eyes and the shackles hanging heavy from his wrists. And he said it quietly, under the sound of the rain, under the sound of the horses and the deputies and Briggs, reading something aloud from the warrant. For official record, everything I felt for you was real, Maeve. His voice was low, steady, absolutely certain. Except my last name. She stared at him. Jedidah. A pause, rain falling between each word. My family name is Calloway. Sterling is my mother's side. Monty is my cousin. And his family framed me for that warrant 5 years ago to take my inheritance. He held her gaze without flinching. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. The deputies were moving now, pulling him toward the horses. She stood in the rain, in the open doorway of her workshop, and watched them take him down the yard path and through the gate and out onto the dark street, the lanterns swinging, the horses' hooves loud on the wet road. Then the street was empty. The rain came down. She stood in the ruins, not the shed ruins. Those were ash and memory, but this new thing, this particular wreckage that was standing in the wet cold, with iron having closed around the wrists of a man she had built a month of her life around, and hearing him say, in the same steady voice he used for everything, that his name was not what he'd given her. His name was not what he'd given her. She went back inside. She sat on the workbench and looked at the folded letter from Vivienne, still sitting there, still dry, and at the lamp burning steadily, and at the workshop that was still standing, and the tools on their hooks, and the pine branch carving on the cabinet panel, drying on the end of the bench. She sat there for maybe 10 minutes. Then she stood up. She went upstairs, and she changed out of her night clothes and into her work clothes, good ones, clean ones, her most solid boots. She came back down and put on her coat, and picked up the letter from the bench and put it in her coat's inner pocket. She checked the Colt revolver and strapped it to her hip under the coat. She picked up the lamp. She stood at the workshop door for just a moment, and she looked back at the bench, at the space where 2 names had been signed on a plain piece of paper, at the tools on their hooks, at the panel with the pine branch carving that she'd added because children deserved beautiful things. She thought about what he'd said, about the frame, about the cousin, about 5 years of carrying a warrant that wasn't his. She thought about his army record, and the burn scar, and the 3 books in his saddlebag, and the way he'd picked up her beam at the station and stepped forward with nothing more than a hat tip and 2 words. She thought about everything I felt for you was real. She believed that part completely. She believed it with the same certainty she brought to reading grain direction. In timber, you developed a sense for it, and it didn't lie. The name she would sort out later. Right now, she had a man in iron shackles in a jail run by a bought sheriff, and a fabricated federal warrant, and a letter in her pocket that could help prove. Both of those things were Monty Sterling's work, and she had a territorial magistrate who logged things properly and who had told her to be careful, which meant he'd been expecting something. She blew out the lamp. She walked out into the rain. The road to Judge Vance's house was 3/4 of a mile, and she walked it in the dark with the rain coming down steady and cold and the mountain wind at her back, and her boots were solid on the road, and the Colt was at her hip, and the letter was in her pocket, and her father's yard was still standing behind her, and the deed to it was in a fireproof box and registered in duplicate at the courthouse. She walked. The rain didn't stop. The dark didn't lighten. The road was empty and long, and the mountains were invisible above her in the clouds. Just a presence, a weight of permanence that she'd grown up under and knew as well as she knew her own hands. She was alone on the road. She had been alone before. She kept walking. Judge Aldous Vance answered his door in a wool robe and reading glasses, which told Maeve he hadn't been asleep. He took one look at her rain-soaked, Colt on her hip, jaw set like a mortise joint, and stepped back to let her in without a word. His study was warm and lamplit, books stacked on every surface, the desk already occupied by an open ledger, and a cup of tea gone cold. He'd been working. At midnight, in the rain, the territorial magistrate of Oakhaven had been at his desk. She stood on his entry rug and dripped. "Sit down, Miss Hollister," he said. "They took Jed Sterling." She didn't sit. Briggs served a federal warrant. Bank robbery and treason. dated March 1873. It's fabricated. Montgomery Sterling's family arranged it 5 years ago to take Jed's inheritance. Vance set his reading glasses on the desk. His expression didn't change much. It compressed slightly, the look of a man organizing incoming information against what he already knew. "Sit down," he said again more quietly. She sat. She pulled the copied letter from her inner pocket and set it on the desk in front of him. It was slightly damp at the edges, but fully legible. "This is a copy in Vivian Sterling's hand. The original is in Monty's document case in the hotel safe. It arranges the arson at my drying shed, specific date, specific wall payment amount." She paused. "Vivian made the copy tonight and brought it to me 2 hours ago." Vance picked up the letter. He read it with the same focused stillness he probably brought to every legal document complete attention. Nothing skimmed. He set it down. "Briggs served this warrant himself," he said, "with 4 deputies. Iron shackles." Vance was quiet for a moment. A county sheriff serving a 5-year-old federal warrant at midnight is irregular on its face. The Portland Circuit would have sent a marshal for a warrant that age if they were sending anyone at all. He looked at the letter. "Combined with this and with the arson report you filed 2 weeks ago, which is in my records, we have a pattern that a territorial court will find difficult to ignore. Can you get Jed out?" "Not tonight." He said it straight, which she appreciated. "Briggs has the legal cover of a valid-looking warrant, and until I can demonstrate it's fraudulent, he can hold the prisoner." But he held up one finger. "A territorial magistrate can issue a writ of inquiry that requires Briggs to produce the warrant's originating documentation within 24 hours. If that documentation doesn't hold up, and given what you're telling me, I suspect it won't, I can move to suspend the arrest." 24 hours, she said. "At minimum." He looked at her directly. "Miss Hollister, what I'm about to do is going to put me in direct opposition to the county sheriff and, by extension, to whatever interests are backing him. I need you to understand that this is not a quick resolution. We are starting a legal proceeding tonight that will likely reach a full hearing. I understand. And you're prepared for that?" She met his eyes. "Judge, that man is in iron shackles because Montgomery Sterling has been working this territory like a chessboard since he got off the stagecoach. He set fire to my yard. He bought my sheriff. He's planning to take my land through legal pressure backed by fabricated warrant. And he's been doing all of it with that same smile he wore when he stood up at our wedding and told everyone present that I wasn't good enough for him." She paused. "I am very prepared." Vance held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "I'll have the writ of inquiry drawn up tonight," he said. "I'll serve it on Briggs personally, at first light. Come to my office at 8 o'clock and bring everything you have deed. Patents, arson report, this letter, everything. It'll be there." She stood. "Miss Hollister." He looked up from the paper. "You walked 3/4 of a mile in the rain at midnight to bring me this. It needed doing tonight." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, beneath its judicial composure, something close to respect. "Go get dry," he said. "You need to be sharp in the morning." She went. She was back at the workshop by 1:30. She changed out of the wet clothes and made coffee and sat at the bench with her ledger and worked through everything she had. Every document, every record, every conversation she'd noted down in the weeks since Monty arrived. She wrote it in sequence. The arrival, the offers on the land, the boot prints, the fire, Briggs's report, Vivian's midnight visit, the warrant, the shackles. She wrote it clearly, in the same hand she used to write measurements, no embellishment, just facts, each one dated. Then she went through Jed's side of it. What she knew, and what she'd need to verify. His name was Calloway. His mother's family was Sterling. Monty was a cousin. A warrant in 1873. Jed would have been 23, recently out of the army. She didn't know the specifics of how it had been arranged, but she knew enough about how legal machinery could be weaponized by money to know it wasn't impossible. Men with resources and patience could construct legal traps that looked real enough to function for years. She closed the ledger. She sat in the quiet workshop and looked at the tools on their hooks. She was angry. A clean, cold, directional anger, the kind that didn't burn itself out because it knew exactly where it was pointed. She was angry at the warrant and the shackles, and Briggs's official coat, and Monty's entire constructed confidence that the world would arrange itself according to his preferences. She was also, underneath the anger, something more complicated about Jed's name. She turned it over. He'd introduced himself as Jed Sterling at the station. He'd signed the agreement as Jed Sterling. He'd spent a month in her workshop and her yard and her daily life, and he hadn't told her. She understood why, probably. A man traveling under a partially assumed name, because a fabricated warrant could get him killed, didn't advertise the situation to a woman he'd just met on a practical business arrangement. She understood the logic of it. Understanding the logic of it and feeling entirely settled about it were two different things. She knew that, and she let herself know it, sitting alone in the workshop in the small hours. She'd sort through the rest of it when she had him out of Briggs's jail and could look at him directly. First things first. At 5:30 in the morning, before full light, she went to Mrs. Miller's diner. Hattie Miller was always there before anyone else. She'd been opening her diner at 5 every morning for 30 years, and when Maeve knocked on the back door, Hattie opened it within 10 seconds, took one look at her, and pulled her inside. "I heard," Hattie said. She already had coffee going. Oak Haven moved fast with news, but Hattie Miller moved faster. 4 deputies in iron shackles. Midnight in the rain. Tom Archer's boy was on the street and saw the whole thing. "I need your help," Maeve said. Obviously. Hattie set a cup in front of her. "What do you need?" Maeve laid it out. The arson letter, the fabricated warrant, the writ of inquiry Vance was drawing up, the 24-hour window. The fact that Briggs was bought and couldn't be trusted, and that the case was going to need more than legal paperwork. It was going to need witnesses, testimony, people who had seen Monty's behavior toward the property over the past weeks and were willing to say so formally. Hattie listened with both hands around her own coffee cup, her eyes steady. "The Garrity brothers," she said, when Maeve finished. "Pete and Cole. They did load work at your yard in July. They saw those city men walking the fence line, and they mentioned it to me at the time. I told them to write it down, and Cole did." She paused. "Ada Fenn at the post office. She handled correspondence for Monty. When he came in, she's noted the volume and the destinations. Ada keeps records of everything, always has." Another pause. "And Tom Archer himself, he's seen Briggs at the hotel twice in the past week, late, when Briggs should have been on the East Patrol route." Maeve was writing. She'd brought her small field ledger, and she wrote each name down. "There are others," Hattie said. "This town has worked with you and your father for 20 years, Maeve. Most of these people remember who gave them fair wages when times were hard and who treated them like they had a name worth knowing." Her voice was plain and simple about it. "You call on them, and they'll come." Maeve looked up from the ledger. Hattie was looking at her with that particular expression, the one that was maternal without being soft, the one that had gotten Maeve through more than one hard stretch. "He treated everyone here right," Maeve said. "Jed. He worked alongside every hand in that yard, and he never once looked at a man like he was beneath him." "I know." Hattie refilled her cup. Word gets around about that, too. By 6 o'clock, Maeve had a list of 7 names. By 6:15, Hattie had sent her young dishwasher, a 14-year-old named Will, out with messages to each of them: "Come to the diner by 7, come quiet, bring what you know." Maeve ate breakfast, a real one, full and warm, because there was going to be a long day, and she needed the fuel, and she had stopped apologizing to herself for that sometime in the past month. She ate eggs and bread and drank 2 cups of coffee, and she sat at the corner table and went through her ledger again. while the diner filled up with the early morning crowd who didn't know yet what was happening. Hattie moved through the room like she always did, coffee pot in one hand, opinions in the other, keeping the whole operation running on the strength of her presence. This was what a town actually was, Maeve thought. Not the buildings or the main street or the official offices. It was this, a woman who'd been making breakfast for 30 years and knew everyone's name and what they'd been through and who among them could be called on. By 7 o'clock, 7 people were sitting around the large back table at the diner. Pete and Cole Garrity, load workers, big-shouldered and practical. Ada Fenn, postmistress, small and exact, with a notebook already out on the table. Tom Archer, who ran the feed store and had the longest memory of anyone in Oakhaven. A woman named Rosa Delaney, who had worked in the Hollister yard for 2 seasons and now ran her own small carpentry shop on the south end. The first woman in town to do so, Maeve and her father, had both bought her first set of chisels. The land office clerk Jed had mentioned, a young man named Davies, who came in looking nervous and determined in equal measure, and a retired Army sergeant named Beaumont, who had moved to Oakhaven after the war and who Maeve knew had more direct knowledge of military record-keeping and how warrants were processed than anyone else for 50 miles. She stood at the head of the table and told them everything. She told them plainly, without drama, in the same direct way she'd written it in the ledger, the land, the railroad, Monty's debt and his commission arrangement, the arson, Briggs, the fabricated warrant. She put the copied letter in the center of the table. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Ada Fenn opened her notebook. I have records of 17 pieces of correspondence dispatched by Montgomery Sterling in the past month. 6 of the destination addresses are associated with the Chicago Pacific Railroad Syndicate, I know, because I look up addresses. That's my job. 3 others are addressed to a law firm in Portland. She tapped the page. I wrote all of it down. Davies, the land office clerk, leaned forward. Sterling submitted 4 property inquiries to our office. He specifically asked about survey discrepancies on the Hollister parcel, whether there were any recorded boundary disputes. There weren't. So he came back a second time with a different set of questions about debt registration against inherited estates. He paused. It was the second visit that made me uncomfortable. I pulled the full file after he left and checked everything. Your title is clean, Miss Hollister. I've noted all of this in my office log. I can get you a certified copy of that log, Maeve said. I'll have it at Vance's office by 8:30. Beaumont, the Army sergeant, spoke last. A federal warrant from March 1873 for bank robbery and treason. A warrant that was never served in 5 years means one of 3 things. Either the subject was untraceable, which an Army scout wouldn't be, or the warrant was issued and then quietly suppressed by someone with federal court access. Or he paused. The warrant was issued based on fabricated testimony, which courts do occasionally review and reverse, but only if someone files for review with documented counter-evidence. He looked at Maeve. If we can establish that the Sterling family had both the motive and the federal connections to arrange a false warrant in 1873, Vance can petition the circuit court for a warrant review. That's a separate proceeding from the property case, but it can run parallel. What do you need for that? Maeve said. Documentation of the original Sterling family finances in 1873. What inheritance was at stake. Whether there's any record of who testified at the warrant proceeding. He paused. And if we can find anyone who can speak to Jed's Army service record, his conduct, anything that establishes who he actually is, that helps. He was a scout, Maeve said. He got 3 men out of a burning ammunition cache. He said it like it was nothing, which means he probably underreported it. She looked at Beaumont. Is there a way to pull service records? Through the regional Army office? Yes. Takes time. He looked at her steadily. What we can do today is file the request. Officially, on record, so it becomes part of Vance's proceeding. She nodded. She looked around the table at these 7 people who had come out at 7 in the morning and put their notebooks and their records and their knowledge on the table without being asked twice, and she held that for a moment, held the full weight of it. "I know what you're all doing," she said. "I know what it costs to stand against a man who has the sheriff and a Chicago syndicate in his corner. I'm asking you to do it anyway, and I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing." Cole Garrity looked at his brother. Then he looked at Maeve. "You paid us square last summer when every other yard in the territory was cutting rates. You didn't cut ours." He said it simply. "That's worth showing up for." Rosa Delaney had her hands flat on the table. "Your father sold me those chisels on credit when I had $11 to my name, told me to pay him back when the work came. It came." She paused. "I've been waiting for a way to pay that back." Ada Fenn had already turned to a fresh page in her notebook. Maeve steadied herself. "All right," she said. "Here's what we do." She laid out the morning. Davies to Vance's office with the certified land inquiry logs. Ada to compile a formal summary of the Sterling correspondence records. Beaumont to draft the service record request for the Army office. Tom Archer and the Garrity brothers to write formal statements about what they'd observed the city men on the fence line. Briggs's hotel visits, anything dated and specific. Rosa to take those statements, witnessed and signed, directly to Vance. Every piece moving simultaneously. Every piece documented and dated and formal. Monty had been operating on the assumption that Maeve was isolated, that she'd look around her and see only the size of what he'd constructed against her and feel the walls closing in. He'd miscounted the room. She was at Vance's office at 8 o'clock exactly, with her full document folder and a dry coat and her hair pinned back, and the Colt still at her hip under the coat because she saw no reason to stop being practical. Vance was already there. Already in his judicial coat, the writ of inquiry on the desk in its finished form. He looked at her folder and at the names of the people already moving through town on her behalf, and his eyebrows rose just slightly. "You've been busy," he said. "The town's been busy," she said. "I just pointed them in a direction." He studied her for a moment. "Miss Hollister, a woman who can organize 7 credible witnesses, a land office clerk, and a service record request before 8 in the morning, is not a woman who needs luck. But I'll give you law, which is better. That's all I'm asking for." He picked up the writ of inquiry. "I'll serve this on Briggs within the hour. He'll have until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to produce the warrant's originating documentation. If he can't or won't, I have grounds to suspend the arrest and transfer jurisdiction." He looked at her over the desk. "But Maeve, Briggs is not going to accept this quietly. Monty will know you've moved. Things may accelerate." "Let them accelerate." Her voice was even. "I'm not standing still and waiting for the wall to hit me. Not anymore." Vance looked at her for a long moment with those careful magistrate's eyes, taking the full measure of the woman standing in his office in work. Clothes, with a revolver on her hip, and 7 witnesses in motion, and a document folder that would make a Portland circuit lawyer sit up straight. He nodded. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine you are." He picked up his hat. The rest of the morning moved the way good work moved piece by piece, each part fitting to the next, the larger structure emerging as the pieces went in. Davies delivered the certified land inquiry log to Vance's office at 8:20 as promised. Ada Fenn's correspondence summary was complete by 9 and witnessed by Tom Archer. Beaumont had the Army record request drafted and on its way to the regional office before 10. The Garrity brothers' statements were detailed, and specific dates, times, descriptions of the city men who'd walked the fence line, dialogue overheard at the feed store between Briggs and one of those men. Cole Garrity had indeed written things down at the time, on the back of a receipt, and the receipt was dated, and Vance accepted it into the formal record without hesitation. Maeve moved between points all morning. From Vance's office to the diner, to the land office, to the courthouse, annex, and back. Her boots loud and purposeful on the main street boards, the document folder under her arm. Oakhaven watched. The town had a way of going quiet when something was happening beneath the surface. A collective holding of breath. People standing a little longer in doorways and speaking a little more carefully to strangers. She could feel it as she moved. People knew. They always knew before anything was official. She passed the hotel twice. Monty was not visible. She didn't look for him specifically, but she noted his absence from the street with the same attention she gave to all information. At noon, she sat on the courthouse steps and ate the bread and cheese. Hattie had pressed into her hands that morning, and she drank water from the courthouse well, and she let herself stop moving for 12 minutes and just breathe. She thought about Jed in Briggs's jail. She thought about iron shackles on wrists. She knew the burn scar underneath, the calloused palms, the hands that had helped her move timber and reset fence posts, and hold a lamp steady in a dark workshop while she worked past midnight. She thought about what he'd said in the rain. Everything I felt for you was real, Maeve, except my last name. She believed the first sentence. She had no trouble at all believing the first sentence. The second sentence, the name. The withheld history she was still working through. But working through something was different from being broken by it. She'd been broken by Monty's revelation once. This was different. This was complicated, and it required a conversation. And conversations required the other person to be present and not in a jail cell. So, first things first. She'd been saying that since midnight, and it was still true. She finished the bread and stood up and went back to work. By 3 o'clock, Vance had served the writ. She heard about it from Davies, who'd been in the courthouse when the news came back. Briggs had taken the writ with the expression of a man who'd been handed something hotter than expected, and he'd said very little, and he'd sent a rider toward the hotel within 20 minutes, which meant Monty knew. She was at the workbench in the afternoon. She'd come back to the workshop because there was actual work that needed doing, and doing nothing while the legal machinery moved was not something she was built for. She was fitting the last of the schoolhouse cabinet panels, the ones that had survived the fire and the chaos of the past 2 weeks, and the work helped. It always helped. Rosa appeared at the workshop door at 3:30. Vance wants you at 4 o'clock. She set down the chisel and went. The 4 o'clock meeting was in Vance's inner office, the formal one, with the territorial seal on the wall and the law books ranked behind his desk. He had Davies there, and Beaumont, and a woman Maeve didn't immediately recognize, who turned out to be a circuit court recorder named Margaret Hale, who had come down from Portland 2 days ago for an unrelated matter, and was now, by what Vance called fortunate timing, available to make things official. Vance laid it out. The writ had been served. Briggs had until 8 o'clock the following morning. The arson letter and Ada's correspondence summary were formally entered into the territorial record. The service record request was filed and expected to return within 5 to 7 days. That's the timeline concerned, Vance said. The warrant review will take longer, but I can issue an emergency protective order on the property tonight. It prevents any transfer, sale, or legal action against the Hollister parcel until the court proceedings conclude. That closes Monty's land play immediately. Do it, Maeve said. Vance had it drafted inside the hour. She signed where she needed to sign and witnessed what needed witnessing. And by 5:30, she walked out of Vance's office with a protective order on her land and a formal evidentiary proceeding underway, and the afternoon light was going gold and cold across the main street of Oakhaven, and she stood on the courthouse steps and let herself feel it for just a moment. She'd started the night with nothing but rain, and a copied letter, and 3/4 of a mile of dark road. She'd ended the day with 7 witnesses, a land office record, a territorial protective order, and a writ of inquiry that was going to make Briggs very uncomfortable in the morning. She thought about what Jed had said in the firelit yard, holding his arm and looking at the burned shed. Every human soul has a right to stand tall and protect their hard work. She thought about what he'd said over her supper plate. weeks ago, in the lamplight of a quiet workshop. Don't ever starve yourself for the sake of fools. She thought about two names on a plain piece of paper, and a hand plane on a workbench, and a black horse standing patient in the paddock every morning. She walked back to the workshop. She had cabinet work to finish, and tomorrow was going to be another long day, and she had a man to get out of a jail cell by any legal means available to her. She rolled up her sleeves and picked up the chisel. The work went quietly, steadily, well into the evening, and outside the main street of Oakhaven, settled into dark, and somewhere across town, a bought sheriff sat with a writ of inquiry burning a hole in his desk. And in the hotel, Montgomery Sterling was having a conversation with his city men that was, for the first time since he'd arrived in Oakhaven, not going the direction he'd planned. The pine branch, carved into the corner of the cabinet frame, caught the lamplight and held it. She kept working. The courthouse had never been so full on a weekday. Oakhaven's main courtroom was a practical space, pine benches, a raised platform for the judge's desk, two tables facing the front for opposing parties, a witness chair positioned to the side where the morning light came through the single tall window. It held maybe 60 people comfortably. By 8:45 that morning, there were 83 people in it, and more standing in the hallway and out on the front steps, and the noise of all of them talking at once was considerable until Vance's bailiff appeared, and the room went quiet with the efficiency of people who understood that the quiet was the beginning of something. Maeve sat at the left table with the document folder in front of her and her hands flat on the wood. She'd been awake since 4. Not from sleeplessness, she'd slept a few hard hours and woken already thinking. She'd gone through the folder one more time in the lamplight, everything in order, everything dated. She'd eaten breakfast at Hattie's because fuel mattered, and she'd learned that lesson well. She'd walked to the courthouse in the cold morning air with her good boots and her clean coat, and the coat left at the workshop because this room required a different kind of authority than a firearm. Davies was 2 rows back in the gallery, his log records in hand. Ada Fenn was beside him with her correspondence summary. The Garrity brothers filled the bench behind them. Rosa Delaney sat at the end of the row nearest the aisle, straight-backed and still. Tom Archer was near the wall. Beaumont was in the second row, with the Army record request confirmation. The regional office had sent back an initial response that morning, faster than expected, and what it contained had made Beaumont's eyebrows go up when he'd read it to Maeve at 6 a.m. She held that information carefully, like a good board you were saving for the right cut. Monty sat at the right table, with a man she didn't recognize, sharp-featured, expensive suit, carrying a leather case with the practiced ease of a Portland lawyer who'd traveled to frontier courts before and found them manageable. Monty himself was composed. She'd give him that. He sat with his hands folded on the table and his social face on. The one that said this was all a minor inconvenience that would resolve itself sensibly. He looked at Maeve once when he came in. She looked back. Neither of them nodded. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Vance came in from the side door. The morning's first hour was procedural. Vance laid the record formally, the writ of inquiry, Briggs's response, the property protective order, the entry of the arson evidence into territorial proceedings. He read each document into the record with the deliberate pace of a man who wanted everything clearly understood by everyone present, not just the lawyers. Briggs sat in the gallery behind Monty's table. He'd produced the warrant documentation that morning at 8 o'clock barely and incomplete. The originating court seal was present, but the supporting testimony record that should have accompanied it was absent. Vance had noted this on the record with the tone of a man making a note he expected to reference later. Monty's lawyer, his name was Crane, and he was everything his suit suggested, rose to make a preliminary argument about jurisdiction. Vance heard him out with complete patience and then declined the jurisdictional challenge in 4 sentences, each one precise each one resting on territorial statute that Crane would have known if he'd prepared more carefully for a frontier magistrate with 30 years on the bench. Crane sat down. Monty's expression didn't change. Maeve watched the room. She watched Vance. She watched the jury of community assessors. 6 people. Vance had appointed at the opening, all of them Oak Haven residents, all of them known quantities. A farmer, a schoolteacher, the woman who ran the hardware store, a retired trapper, the Methodist minister, a young widow who did bookkeeping for 3 businesses on the main street. She knew every one of them. She'd done business with most of them. She didn't read anything into their faces that wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't useful to her, but she was aware of them. The way you were aware of the people standing around a fire, conscious of who was there. The first witness was Davies. He took the chair and stated his name and position, and Vance asked him to describe the nature of Montgomery Sterling's inquiries at the land office. Davies answered clearly and specifically, dates and questions, and the exact language Monty had used on the second visit when he'd asked about debt registration against inherited estates. He produced his certified log, and Vance entered it into evidence. Crane cross-examined. He tried 3 different angles, suggesting the inquiries were routine investment research, suggesting Davies had no way to assess intent from questions, suggesting the log itself was informal and therefore unreliable. Davies answered each angle with the same steady specificity. The log was an official office document. The questions were recorded verbatim. The dates were accurate. Crane let him go. Ada Fenn came next. She opened her notebook on the witness chair arm and read from it without hurry. 17 pieces of correspondence, 6 addressed to entities associated with the Chicago Pacific Railroad, syndicate she named them. She'd done the research. 3 to a Portland law firm with a documented history of frontier property dispute work. She noted the volume increase in the 2 weeks following the fire at the Hollister yard. Crane tried to argue that a postmistress noting the destinations of correspondence was a privacy violation. Vance looked at him with the mild expression of a man who had heard worse arguments and found them equally unpersuasive. He noted for the record that the destinations of correspondence handled through a public post office were not protected private information and moved on. Tom Archer spoke about Briggs' hotel visits. Precise times, precise dates. He'd noted them in his feed store ledger. He noted everything in his ledger, he said, because 30 years of running a business had taught him that memory was unreliable and paper was not. Vance received the ledger entries. The Garrity brothers spoke together, Pete first and then Cole, the city men on the fence line. The conversation Cole had overheard outside the feed store, one of the city men asking about access routes to the northern land parcels, and Briggs, who'd been present, saying nothing about trespass. Through all of it, Monty sat with his hands folded. Crane took notes. The room listened. Maeve's hand stayed flat on the table. At 11 o'clock, Vance called the arson evidence. He read the copied letter into the record himself, in full, clearly. The room, which had been attentive before, went to a different quality of quiet. The specific language, the instructions about the eastern wall, the payment sum, the date landed in the room, with the weight of something that couldn't be taken back once it was out. Crane rose immediately. The letter was a copy. The original had not been produced. The copy was in a private individual's handwriting and could not be verified. Vance acknowledged all 3 points. He was expecting them. The copy is entered as supporting evidence, not primary evidence, he said. The court notes that the original document is alleged to be in the possession of the defendant within the hotel safe. I am prepared to issue a search order for that safe at any point in these proceedings if the defense wishes to challenge the copy's accuracy by producing the original. Crane sat down rather quickly. Monty's composure held, but she could see it costing more than it had this morning. His hands, still folded, were pressing against each other harder than before. Beaumont took the witness chair for the Army records. He stated his background: 15 years of service, specific experience with military court proceedings, and warrant documentation. He explained, for the room's benefit, how federal warrants of the 1,873 period were issued and what documentation should accompany them. He explained what was absent from the warrant Briggs had produced. He described the initial response from the Regional Army Office regarding one Jedediah Calloway, former Army Scout, service dates 1,869 to 1,874. He read the relevant portion of that response. The room was very still. Jed Calloway's service record, per the regional office's initial confirmation, included a commendation for valor at an incident in the spring of 1,873. 3 soldiers recovered from a burning ammunition cache, the Scout sustaining significant injury in the process. The commendation was specific, and the date was 2 weeks after the warrant alleged he had committed bank robbery 200 miles away. Crane objected. An initial response from a regional office was not a certified service record. Beaumont agreed that the full certified record was still incoming. He noted that the initial confirmation was signed by the regional adjutant and was itself an official Army communication. Vance received it with the caveat that the full record would be entered upon arrival. He looked at Crane over his reading glasses. Does the defense wish to argue that a commendation for valor is not credible character evidence? Crane did not wish to argue that. Monty's lawyer asked for a recess at 11:40. Vance gave him 20 minutes. Maeve stepped into the hallway, where the air was cooler and the crowd thinner. Mrs. Miller appeared at her elbow with a cup of water and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, with the expression of a woman who had decided that the court proceedings were not going to interfere with basic nutrition. Maeve drank the water. Rosa Delaney came and stood beside her. "He's rattled," she said quietly. Crane keeps leaning over and Monty keeps shaking his head. They're disagreeing about something. Maeve had seen it too, through the table's width distance. "Crane wants to change strategy," she said. "Monty thinks he still has something to play." "Does he?" She thought about it honestly. He might think Briggs can be a stronger witness than he's been, or he's holding something about Jed's identity that he thinks will still land. She ate some of the bread. "We'll know when we go back in." She went back in. At 12:15, Vance called the afternoon session to order. Crane stood. He announced that the defense intended to call a witness. Monty was still at the table, still composed or near enough. He had clearly made a decision during the recess, and the decision had a quality of confidence to it that Maeve noted carefully. A man who looked confident when he should be worried was either holding something real or performing harder than before. Crane called Sheriff Cal Briggs. Briggs took the witness chair with the expression of a man who had negotiated his way into this position and was now prepared to be useful. He was in his official coat. His badge caught the window light. Crane walked him through a prepared statement, Briggs's account of receiving the federal warrant through proper channels, his correspondence with the Portland Circuit, his legal obligation to serve the warrant promptly once it had been formally presented to his office. All of it technically accurate, all of it structured to make the midnight arrest sound routine and professionally executed. Then Crane moved to Jed's identity. He asked Briggs to speak to what he knew of Jedediah Sterling's background. Briggs spoke. He described Jed's arrival in Oakhaven, his residence at the Hollister yard, his use of the Sterling name. He implied carefully that the use of a partial assumed name was itself evidence of someone with reason to conceal their identity. The room shifted slightly. She felt it. Then Vance said, "Miss Hollister, your witness." She stood. She'd prepared questions with Vance the previous evening, seated at his desk while the lamp burned low and the rain came down outside. She had them written in the ledger. She didn't need to look at them. She walked to the center of the room and faced Briggs. "Sheriff," she said, "when did you receive the warrant for Jedediah Calloway?" A brief pause. Calloway is not Jedediah Calloway is the man's legal name that is now part of this court's record. When did you receive the warrant? Briggs looked at Crane. Crane gave nothing. 11 days ago, Briggs said. 11 days ago. She let that sit for a moment. But you served it the night before last. Why the gap? I was verifying its legitimacy. 11 days to verify a document that arrived from the Portland Circuit. She tilted her head. What was the nature of that verification? Standard procedure. Did you contact the Portland Circuit office directly during that 11 days? A pause. I sent correspondence. Have you received a reply? Longer pause. Not yet. So at the time you served the warrant, with iron shackles, at midnight in the rain, you had not yet received confirmation of its validity from the issuing office. Briggs's jaw tightened. The warrant was facially valid, and yet the supporting testimony record that should accompany a warrant of this type was absent. She kept her voice level. Judge Vance noted that absence on the record this morning. Did you note that absence when the warrant arrived? It was still a valid warrant. She moved forward slightly. Sheriff, Tom Archer has testified that he observed you at the Grand Hotel on 2 occasions in the past week outside your patrol hours. Were you meeting with Montgomery Sterling on those occasions? Crane was on his feet. Objection. Relevance. The witness's relationship with the defendant is directly relevant to his motivations for serving an incomplete warrant, Maeve said, looking at Vance. Vance looked at Briggs. Answer the question. Briggs said nothing for a moment that went on too long. Sheriff, Vance said, I had conversations with Mr. Sterling about community investment matters, Briggs said carefully. He is a property. Did he compensate you for those conversations? The room went very still. Briggs looked at Crane. Crane was writing something rapidly on his notepad. Monty's hands, still folded on the table, were white at the knuckles. I don't have to answer that, Briggs said. You do, Vance said quietly. This is a territorial proceeding, and you are under oath, Sheriff. The silence stretched. No comment, Briggs said. Vance made a note. His face was entirely composed, which, in her experience, meant he was paying the closest possible attention. No comment is itself an answer, he said to the record. Continue, Miss Hollister. She had 3 more questions. She asked them all, and Briggs answered 2 with careful evasions and 1 with a flat denial that the room received with audible skepticism. She thanked him and sat down. Crane didn't try to redirect. Briggs left the witness chair, looking smaller than he'd arrived. Monty took the stand voluntarily. That surprised her. She hadn't expected it. A man with his exposure sitting voluntarily in a witness chair meant one of 2 things: genuine confidence in what he was holding, or a catastrophic miscalculation. He was smooth. He'd always been smooth. He described his return to Oakhaven in terms of investment and development, genuine interest in the territory's future, family connection to the community. He framed his inquiries about Maeve's land as legitimate market research. He characterized the warrant against Jed as a pre-existing legal matter that had nothing to do with him. Crane led him carefully through all of it, building a picture of a reasonable businessman caught in an unfortunate set of coincidences. Then Vance looked at Maeve. She stood again. She started with the railroad. Did he have a financial arrangement with the Chicago Pacific Railroad Syndicate? He acknowledged business discussions. Was there a commission structure for land acquisition? He called it a consulting arrangement. She walked him through Ada Fenn's correspondence records, reading destination names aloud, watching him manage his answers as the list got longer and more specific. Then she placed the copied letter on the table in front of him. Mr. Sterling, this letter, copied by your wife in your own handwriting, arranges for the deliberate arson of my drying shed on the night of October 14th. Do you deny writing the original of this document? He looked at the letter. He looked at Crane. He looked at the room. That document, he said, is a copy made by an unhappy woman who has been manipulated by... Do you deny writing the original? His voice shifted just slightly, just enough. I deny that document represents any instruction I gave to anyone. That's not the same as denying you wrote it, she said. The room heard it. She saw it move through the gallery. The slight collective leaned forward, the recognition of the distinction. She had one more question. She'd been saving it. Mr. Sterling, Jedediah Calloway is your cousin. You share the Sterling family name through his mother's side. In March of 1873, your family stood to inherit a substantial estate from your shared grandfather. Is that correct? Crane was on his feet. Objection. The defendant's family relationship to the man currently held in custody is directly relevant to the fabricated warrant allegation, Vance said. Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Sterling. Monty's smooth composure had a crack in it now. Small, but visible. Family financial matters are private, he said. They are, she agreed. But they are also matters of legal record in probate courts. The Vance court has requested those records from the Portland probate office. She looked at him steadily. I'll ask again. In March 1873, your family stood to receive the Sterling inheritance. Jedediah Calloway, as a blood heir, had a competing claim to that estate. Within weeks of that estate being settled in your family's favor, a federal warrant was issued against Jedediah Calloway based on testimony from members of your family. She paused. Do you deny that sequence of events? Monty looked at her. For a moment, in that courtroom, with the morning light through the tall window and 83 people watching, and the record open and the evidence entered, Montgomery Sterling looked at Maeve Hollister, and she saw it happen the calculation behind his eyes, running the options, finding them narrowed. I don't have to answer speculative questions, he said. No, she said. You don't. She sat down. She was steady all the way to her chair. She was steady when she set her hands flat on the table. She was steady when she felt the room's attention shift, the weight of all those people who had watched this proceeding and were now drawing their own conclusions. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman walked in. Vivian Sterling was in a plain, dark traveling dress, with no jewelry and her hair pinned simply, and she walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with the posture of someone who has made a decision and gotten to the other side of being afraid of it. She walked to the front, and she looked at Judge Vance. I would like to testify, she said. The room erupted. Vance's gavel came down twice, and the room settled, and he looked at Vivian with a measured expression that held no surprise in it whatsoever. Mrs. Sterling, he said, take the stand. At the defendant's table, Monty had gone very still. Crane leaned toward him and said something in a rapid, low voice. Monty didn't respond. He was watching Vivian walk to the witness chair with an expression that was finally and completely unmanaged. Vivian sat down. She was composed in a way Maeve recognized not natural composure, but arrived at composure, the kind you built deliberately when you needed it. She had a leather document envelope in her hands, Vance said. Mrs. Sterling, you are under territorial oath. Do you understand? I do, Vivian said. Tell the court what you know. She opened the envelope. Inside was a ledger leather-bound, small, densely written. She set it on her knee. This is Montgomery Sterling's private financial ledger for the period. January 1876 through October 1878. It documents his debts, his creditors, his arrangements with the Chicago Pacific Railroad Syndicate, including commission rates and named land parcels, and his payments to Sheriff Briggs. The room went to its deepest quiet yet. She looked at Vance. I also have in this envelope the original letter arranging the arson of the Hollister drying shed, in my husband's handwriting, which I removed from the hotel safe this morning. She held it out. Vance's bailiff carried it to the bench. Vance opened it and looked at Vivian and said, How did you obtain this? I know the combination to the safe, Vivian said. He told me when we arrived in case of emergency. A pause, I decided. This constituted one. Crane was on his feet objecting about admissibility, about spousal evidence, about chain of custody. Vance heard each objection and, addressed each one in the measured, thorough, unhurried manner of a man who had anticipated all of them and prepared accordingly. The original letter, in the defendant's own handwriting, was entered into evidence. The financial ledger, as Vivian's personal copy that she had maintained, she explained clearly that she had kept parallel records throughout the marriage, as personal documentation was entered as a supporting exhibit. Crane cross-examined Vivian for 30 minutes. She answered every question, clearly, specifically, without flinching. She had been keeping records for 2 years, she said. She had been waiting for a moment when there was a court that would receive them. She had stayed in the marriage because she had no resources of her own, and because she had been told, repeatedly, that there was no version of the law that would protect her if she tried to leave. She had, she said, recently updated her assessment of that claim. When Crane sat down, the room was very quiet. Vance looked at his notes. Then he looked at the assessors. Then he looked at the room. "I've heard enough to proceed," he said. The assessors took 40 minutes. Maeve sat in the hallway with Mrs. Miller and Rosa Delaney, and she drank coffee that had gone lukewarm, and she did not let herself think about anything beyond the next immediate moment, which was a skill she'd developed in the workshop. When you were waiting for glue to set or wood to dry, you turned to the next thing available, and you did that. She talked to Rosa about the South End carpentry shop. She talked to Mrs. Miller about the diner's winter menu. She listened to the sound of the building around her, the murmur of voices in the courtroom, the creak of the old pine floors. The bailiff appeared at the hallway door at 2:50 in the afternoon. "Judge Vance is ready." She went in. The assessors had found the arson evidence credible and the warrant fraudulent. Vance read their findings into the record with his full judicial voice, and then he read his own findings. And then he issued 4 orders in sequence. The first, Jedediah Calloway, held in the county jail, was to be released immediately. The arrest warrant was suspended pending full review by the Portland Circuit Court, with the court's documented finding of probable fabrication entered into the federal record. The second, Montgomery Sterling, was remanded into custody, pending charges of arson, fraud, conspiracy to defraud a property holder, and corruption of a county official. He was to be held in the territorial facility in Portland, outside Briggs's jurisdiction, pending a full circuit court proceeding. The third, Sheriff Cal Briggs, was suspended from his duties effective immediately, pending investigation of the bribery allegation by the Territorial Oversight Office. His badge was to be surrendered to the bailiff before he left the building. The fourth, the protective order on the Hollister parcel, was extended indefinitely, and any and all claim or proceeding by the Chicago Pacific Railroad Syndicate regarding that parcel was to be routed through the territorial court, rather than any county office. Vance set down his papers. He looked at the room over his reading glasses, with the expression of a man who had done what the law required and found it sufficient. Monty was on his feet, and Crane was trying to manage him, and the bailiff was moving toward the defendant's table with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before. Monty said something sharp and fast that Maeve couldn't hear across the room, and then the bailiff had his arm, and his voice was cut off by the general noise of the room breaking open. Briggs sat in the gallery and unpinned his badge with the careful movements of a man who had run out of options. Vivian Sterling sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap and her envelope on her knee, and the expression of someone sitting in a room that had just become, for the first time in a long while, a room she could breathe in. Maeve looked at her across the courtroom. Vivian looked back. Maeve nodded once slowly. Vivian held her gaze and then looked down at her hands, and there was something in the lowering of her eyes that was not defeat, but its opposite. The quiet of a person setting something down that they'd been carrying for too long. Mrs. Miller was gripping Maeve's arm from the bench behind her and saying something that Maeve couldn't quite hear over the noise of the room. Davies, was shaking hands with Beaumont. The Garrity brothers were on their feet. Tom Archer had his hat off and was turning it in his hands with a wide, uncomplicated smile. And Rosa Delaney, at the end of the row, caught Maeve's eye and held up her hand, the hand that had, years ago, held a new set of chisels bought on credit, and she opened it palm out. A simple gesture. Acknowledgement. Solidarity. One working woman to another, across a pine-floored courtroom in a frontier town. Maeve raised her own hand in return. Then she put her coat on and picked up her folder and walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon air. And the sun was low and golden over the mountain line, and the street was already filling with people who'd heard the verdict carried out by the running feet of Tom Archer's son. She stood on the courthouse steps. The territorial jail was 2 blocks north. She walked. The territorial jail was a low stone building set back from the main street, squat and practical, with one barred window facing north and a heavy oak door that had seen better decades. The deputy on the door, not one of Briggs's men, a younger one who'd kept himself clear of the whole mess, had already received the release order from Vance's bailiff by the time Maeve arrived. He looked at the order, looked at her, and went inside without unnecessary conversation. She stood on the step and waited. The street behind her was carrying the noise of the courthouse verdict spreading through town. She could hear it, moving voices, picking up and passing the news along, the particular sound of a small community processing, something significant. She didn't turn around to watch it. She faced the door. It opened. Jed came out into the afternoon light and stopped on the step. He looked like 2 days in a cell. Jaw unshaved, shirt wrinkled. The left sleeve still pushed up from where they'd processed him. The iron marks were on his wrists, not broken skin, but visible red-brown pressure marks that would take a few days to fade. He held the wrists slightly away from his sides, in the unconscious posture of someone whose hands had recently been in restraints. His eyes found her immediately. He stood there for a moment and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything right away. There was a lot between them, and they both knew it. The name, the history. 2 days of iron and stone floor. A month of workshop mornings and fence posts and suppers and a signed agreement that had stopped being purely practical somewhere around the 3rd week. He said, "You got me out. Vance got you out," she said. "I gave him the tools." Jed looked at the document folder under her arm, at her coat, at her boots. He looked at the courthouse 2 blocks south, where the noise of the crowd was still carrying. "The verdict," he said. "Monty's remanded. Portland facility. Territorial charges. Briggs is suspended." She paused. Vivian testified. She brought his financial ledger and the original arson letter. He was quiet for a moment, taking that in. She did that. She did. He exhaled, slow and full, the breath of a man releasing something he'd been holding for longer than 2 days. He looked at the sky. The late afternoon light was going amber, the mountains catching it on their high faces, the valley below them already cooling toward evening. He looked back at her. She held his gaze, and she said what needed saying, because they were not people who left important things hanging in the air. "You should have told me your name," she said, "before I signed that agreement." "Yes," he said. No deflection, no explanation offered first. Just yes. "I should have. I'm not asking you to justify it. I understand the warrant and what it meant for you to be moving under partial cover. I understand the risk." She kept her voice even. "But I signed my name next to yours on a piece of paper, and I didn't know what your name was. That matters." "It does," he said. "I'm sorry, Maeve." She looked at him for a long moment, at the steady eyes and the jail-worn state of him, and the burn scar on his forearm, and the wrist marks from 2 days of iron. At the man who had stepped forward at the station with a 12-foot beam and 2 words, who had piled food on her plate and said, "Don't ever starve yourself for the sake of fools," who had sat with her on the bench in the ash smell, dark and not left when she'd told him he could sleep. "All right," she said. He looked at her carefully. "All right, we still have things to talk about." She shifted the folder under her arm. But not here and not tonight. Tonight you need a meal and a proper bed and your arm looked at. He glanced at the burn. It had been 2 days without fresh salve or rewrapping. It's manageable. I'll be the judge of that. She turned from the step. Come on. Hattie's expecting us. Mrs. Miller's diner closed to the public at 7, but on this particular evening it did not feel closed. The tables had been pushed together, and there was food on them in the way that only happened when Hattie Miller decided a situation warranted a real spread roast chicken and root vegetables and fresh bread and apple preserves and coffee, and, at the end of the long table, a pie that had not been on the official menu. The people who'd testified were there. Davies and Ada, and the Garrity brothers, and Tom Archer, and Rosa and Beaumont. Mrs. Miller herself, moving between the kitchen and the table, with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years feeding people through hard moments and knew exactly how it was done. When Maeve and Jed came through the door, the room went quiet for a second, and then Cole Garrity started clapping, and it moved around the table quickly, and Jed stood in the doorway of the diner, with that particular stillness he had taken things in before responding. And then he nodded once, slowly, at the table, and that seemed to communicate everything it needed to. Hattie appeared from the kitchen, looked Jed up and down with frank assessment, and said, "Sit. You look like something the creek washed up." "Good evening, ma'am." "Jed, it is now." She pointed at a chair. "Sit." He sat. The evening went the way. Those evenings go food and coffee, and the slow unwinding of tension that had been held at full stretch for too many days. People talked. The courtroom got retold from 6 different vantage points, each one adding a detail the others had missed. Beaumont described Crane's face during Vivienne's testimony with the measured satisfaction of a man who rarely allowed himself that kind of pleasure. Ada Fenn had, characteristically, written notes during the proceedings, and she read select passages aloud with the neutral precision of the official record, which made the moments she described somehow funnier than they had been in real time. Jed listened to all of it. He ate seriously, steadily, the way a man ate who hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days, and he listened, and occasionally he said something brief and direct that landed well in the room. Maeve watched him across the table. She watched him with these people, the careful respect he gave each person who spoke, the attention he paid to the room, the easy way he sat among working people without performance or pretense. She'd been watching him for a month, and she knew these things. But she was watching anyway, because sometimes you saw something you already knew, and it landed differently than it had before. After the pie was served and the coffee cups were refilled, Hattie came and sat in the empty chair beside Maeve and looked at her with the particular expression that needed no translation. Maeve said, quietly, "Don't start." "I'm not starting anything," Hattie said. "I'm just sitting here. You have a look on your face. I always have a look on my face. It's my face." She poured more coffee into Maeve's cup. "He's a good man." "I know he is. The name thing. We'll handle the name thing." Hattie nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked him." Maeve looked at Jed across the table, where he was listening to Tom Archer describe the look on Briggs's face when he'd surrendered his badge. She thought about her father, about a man who'd handed her a planer the morning after the worst day of her life and said there's walnut needs flattening. About a man who'd gone very still around Monty Sterling, like a horse that had caught a wrong smell. "Yes," she said, "he would have." She dressed Jed's burn that night in the workshop. He sat on the stool by the secondary bench with his sleeve rolled up, and she brought the salve and clean linen and the small basin of warm water that she kept for this kind of work, and she cleaned the burn carefully and applied the salve with steady hands. The new burn had grown into the old scar tissue in the way Beaumont had described better than it had any right to be, but real and raw in its own way. He held still. She worked. The workshop was quiet around them. The lamp was on the hook above the bench, steady and warm. Outside, Oakhaven had settled into its nighttime rhythms, and through the single east window, The first stars were coming out above the mountain line. "You were in the Army 3 years," she said. Not a question. She'd heard Beaumont's testimony. "Scout detail, mostly," he said. "Frontier postings. I wasn't meant to be in long, but the work suited me and they needed people who could read land well." He looked at his arm while she worked. The cache fire was 60 miles outside Fort Dalles. "I was the closest when it went up. You didn't have to go in. The 3 men inside didn't have to be stationed there either." He said it simply, without heroism in it. They had families. She wound the clean linen around his forearm, slowly and precisely, the way she joined wood, no gaps, no excess, everything serving a purpose. "Your commendation was 2 weeks after the warrant date," she said. "I know, which means you were in the field being commended for pulling soldiers out of a fire while Monty's family was in a Portland court, testifying that you'd robbed a bank." His jaw moved slightly. "That's what happened." "How did you find out?" "Letter from my mother's sister, 6 months later. By then, the estate had been settled. My grandfather's land, the mining rights, the Portland properties, all of it went to the Sterling side because the Calloway heir was a convicted felon." He said it flat and factual, the way a man said things he'd had years to process. "I couldn't fight it from the field. And when I got out of the Army, I had a warrant that meant anywhere I went under my own name, I was a wanted man. So you used Sterling. Half my blood is Sterling. It's not false, exactly. It just omits." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking for a way back to my own name for 5 years. When I heard Monty was in Oakhaven, and I knew what he was likely after I thought, if I could get close enough to the situation, and things came to court." "You could expose the warrant in a proceeding that was already on record," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She tied off the linen, sat back, looked at the work. "Clean, tight, good." Then she looked at him. "You came to Oakhaven for Monty," she said. "I came because of Monty," he said. "What happened with you?" He stopped. He started again carefully. "The arrangement I proposed was honest on its face. I needed residency. You needed an ally." That was true. He held her gaze. "What happened after was not something I planned or angled for. I want you to know that clearly." She looked at him for a long moment, at the serious, weathered face and the steady eyes, and the burn scar she'd dressed now more times than she could count. "I know," she said. He let out a slow breath. "I'm still angry about the name," she said. "I know that too." "Good." She stood and put the salve tin back on the shelf within his reach, where she'd kept it from the beginning. "We'll talk more when there's time and the world isn't on fire. Literally this time," he said. She looked at him. His expression was completely serious. And then it wasn't, and she laughed a real one, surprised out of her, and the sound of it in the quiet workshop seemed to clear some remaining charge out of the air. He almost smiled, that almost smile she'd catalogued across a month of mornings. "Go to sleep, Jed," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The next week was quieter than any week had been since Monty arrived in Oakhaven. The world did not stop, of course. The protective order meant the land was secure. The Portland Circuit confirmed receipt of the warrant review petition, with an estimated timeline of 3 to 4 weeks for a formal decision. Vance had the interim territorial appointment process for a new sheriff underway, and in the meantime, 2 deputies from the circuit marshal's office were stationed in Oakhaven, which was a more reliable arrangement than Briggs had been for some time, apparently. The drying shed, rebuilding, resumed. She and Jed went back to it together, and the new frame went up faster with 2 people who understood each other's working rhythms. The north wall came out 14 feet as planned. The ridge ventilation went in better than she designed it, because Jez suggested a modification to the angle that she looked at for 10 minutes and then agreed was correct. The signed agreement on the corner of the bench had technically expired. Neither of them referenced that. She noticed he'd moved certain things from the back quarters to the main workshop, a book on the secondary bench, his tack on the hook nearest the door. Small things. She noticed, and she said nothing. and she moved around them as natural additions to the space. On the Wednesday of that week, Vivian came to the yard. She came in the afternoon in plain clothes, with a small traveling bag. She told Maeve she was leaving on the Friday coach to Portland first, then by rail to Cincinnati. Her aunt had written back within days. The room was ready. Maeve walked with her through the yard and showed her the new shed frame going up. "It'll be bigger than the one that burned," Maeve said. Vivian looked at the frame. "Good," she said, simply, without elaboration. They stood there a moment. "Are you afraid?" Maeve asked. "Of going?" Vivian considered it honestly. "Of certain things," she said. "Of starting over with nearly nothing. Of what comes next legally, when the divorce proceedings, if there are proceedings." She paused. "Of whether I've waited too long and lost the habit of deciding things for myself." Maeve looked at her. "You took a ledger and an original arson letter out of a hotel safe and walked into a courtroom with them. Alone. Under oath." A pause. "I think the habit's still there." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then something in her face released, not dramatically, just the small shift of a weight setting down. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." They said goodbye at the workshop door. Vivian held Maeve's hand briefly, both of them just standing there in the afternoon light, without needing to wrap it in too many words. Then she walked back up the main street, and Maeve went back to the shed frame. The full certified Army service record arrived from the regional office on a Thursday, 9 days after the trial. Beaumont brought it to the workshop himself, in the mid-morning when the light was good and Maeve was at the bench, and Jed was setting ridge poles on the new shed. Beaumont handed the sealed envelope to Maeve, and she took it outside and called to Jed. He came down from the shed frame, and she held it out. He looked at it. He took it. He opened it, standing in the yard, with the mountain wind coming down, and sawdust on his hands, and she stood beside him and read it alongside him, and it was exactly what Beaumont had described and more. Service dates, postings, commendations, the cache fire incident, written out in formal military language that nevertheless conveyed the size of what had happened. Character references from 2 officers. A final discharge notation of honorable, with distinction. At the bottom, his name, Jedediah Thomas Calloway. He stood looking at it for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. After a while, he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, close to his chest, and he looked out at the mountain line for another moment, with an expression she didn't try to interpret. It was his to have. Then he picked up his tools and went back up the shed frame. She went back to the bench. That evening she made supper a proper one, not a working meal. At the bench, but at the table she never used, the one by the workshop window that had been her father's eating table when he worked late. She set 2 places with the good plates she kept on the high shelf. She made the bread herself. Jed came in from the paddock at 6 and stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. "Sit," she said. She was at the stove. He sat, they ate, and they talked. That evening, more than they'd talked in the month previous. He told her about his grandfather, a straight-backed Scottish immigrant who'd come over with $20 and worked mining claims until he had land, and then worked the land until he had real property, and passed it to his children and grandchildren, with the explicit instruction that it stay in the family. He told her about his mother, a Sterling daughter, who'd married a Calloway man and been quietly disapproved of by the Sterling side for doing so, because Callaways were working people, and Sterlings had aspirations. She died when he was 16. He told her about the day he'd found out about the warrant, the letter from his aunt, read in a field camp outside Fort Dalles in the rain, how he'd sat with it for 3 days before he could think clearly about what it meant. She told him about her father's first winter, the $40 and the handsaw and the shed he'd built before he had a workshop. She'd heard the story so many times she knew every detail, and she told it that way, with all the details, and it felt right to give him that the whole of where the yard came from, the whole shape of it. She told him about the morning after Monty left, The workshop and the planer and her father's quiet, exact understanding of what she needed, which was not sympathy but occupation. She'd never told that story to anyone in full. She told it to Jed. He listened to all of it. He listened with his full attention and his coffee cup in both hands and his eyes on her across the table, and he didn't offer commentary or consolation. He just received it, the way good timber received a well-set joint completely, without resistance. They washed the dishes together after, because there were two of them and two sets of dishes, and it was the practical thing. On Saturday morning, Jed said he wanted to walk the river. The Oakhaven River ran along the eastern edge of town before bending south toward the valley, and there was a stretch of bank below the old mill site where the water was quiet and the grass held on late into the autumn, brown and flattened, but still present. She'd gone there since she was a girl. It was the kind of place a town had, usually, that everyone knew about, without it being officially a place. They walked out after breakfast in the cool, late autumn morning, following the path through the scrub growth below the town's eastern edge, and the river came into sound before it came into sight, the clean, unhurried sound of moving water over smooth stone. The bank was open, and the light was good. The mountains across the valley were fully white now on their upper faces. The sky was the sharp pale blue of late October, and the aspens along the bank had dropped most of their leaves, which lay in wet gold layers along the grass. They walked for a while without particular direction, following the bank upstream. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. She had hers in her coat. The ground was soft under their boots. He told her about the inheritance. He told her the full shape of it, the grandfather's estate, the terms of the will, the way the Sterling family had worked the probate timing around the fabricated warrant, the specific properties involved, the mining rights in the Cascade foothills, the Portland parcels, his estimate of what the estate had been worth. He'd known all of it for 5 years and had no legal recourse while the warrant stood. Now, with the warrant review underway, and the trial record establishing the fabrication clearly, Beaumont and Vance both believed he had a strong case for a state review. Not a certainty, but a genuine arguable case. She listened to all of it. "What do you want from it?" she asked. "If the review goes your way," he thought about it seriously. "The mining rights are probably gone, sold on years ago, and too tangled to recover. The Portland property." He paused. "I don't know yet. I'd have to see what's there and what it's worth before I could say what to do with it." He looked at the river. "What I want, mostly, is my name back. The property matters less than that." "Jedediah Thomas Calloway," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I read it over your shoulder," she said. "I know you did." She looked at the river. The water was clear and shallow near the bank, moving steadily over the stones, indifferent to the season's changes in the way rivers were doing what they'd always done, finding their way. "It suits you better," she said. "Calloway." He was quiet for a moment. "You think so?" "Sterling always had a borrowed quality on you." She thought about how to say it. "Calloway sounds like something you'd keep in your own pocket." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the bank ahead of them, at where the grass gave way to a flat shelf of stone right at the water's edge, with the mountain view opening out across the valley. He said, "Come sit for a minute." They sat on the flat stone, facing the river and the mountains beyond it. The water moved. The cold came off it steadily, clean and mineral. She waited. She could feel that he was building toward something. She'd known Jed long enough to know what it looked like when he was assembling words with particular care. He turned to look at her. "I need to tell you something I haven't said yet," he said. She met his eyes. "The arrangement was real, the way I told you," he said. "The residency, the practical benefit, all of that was true. But I knew inside the first week that what I felt around you was not part of any arrangement." He held her gaze steadily. "I should have told you the name before the contract. I should have told you the history before the fire. I made choices out of caution that I should have made out of honesty, and I knew they were the wrong choices while I was making them." A pause. "I can give you reasons for all of it." But I don't think reasons are what you need from me. She held his gaze. What do I need from you? The truth going forward, he said, without exception. She looked at him for a long moment, at the serious, weathered face, the burn scar on his arm, the wrist marks that were fading now, day by day, but still present, the dark, steady eyes that had looked at her across a month of mornings and never once looked at her with anything but straightforward regard. That's what I need, she said. Yes. He reached into his jacket pocket. He brought out something wrapped in a small piece of clean cloth. She hadn't seen him carry it before, and he unwrapped it in his palm and held it there. A ring, silver, hand-forged, simple in its shape, but not in its craft. She could see the hammer marks in it, the particular texture of work done by hand with attention. She didn't know when he'd had it made, but she thought about the evenings he'd been gone longer than the paddock check required, and she thought she knew. He looked at the ring in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at her. He dropped to one knee on the riverbank stone, and the grass and the wet leaves were around him, and the river was moving behind him, and the mountains were enormous and white-capped across the valley. And he took her hand in both of her large, pine resin-stained, calloused hand, the hand that had built and carried and gripped and held through every season of this yard's life. He lifted it gently and held it between his palms. You are the most beautiful, formidable woman I have ever known, Maeve. His voice was low and certain, the same voice he'd used for everything. Across this whole improbable month for work instructions and hard truths and the simple statement that her body needed fuel to build masterpieces. You don't need to change a single inch of your body to be worthy of a devoted love. He slid the ring onto her finger. She looked at it. Silver on her hand, modest and exact, made for the finger it was on. She looked at him, still kneeling on the stone, looking up at her with those steady eyes. She thought about a signed agreement on a workbench, about a man who'd stepped forward at a stagecoach station with 2 words and no explanation needed, about pine resin and burned salve and the sound of a mallet in the morning, about sitting on a bench in the dark after a fire, drinking coffee that was still warm, about a name she hadn't known and a month she wouldn't have traded. She pressed her other hand over both his hands and her own, and she held it there. Get up, she said. Her voice was steady, warm, entirely certain. You'll get your knee wet. He stood. He was standing very close, and she looked up at him, and he looked at her. And the river ran beside them, and the mountains held the sky, and the cold air smelled of water and pine, and the first coming edge of winter. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, quietly, briefly, with the same economy he brought to everything that mattered to him. She felt the warmth of it through to the cold in her fingers. They stood there on the riverbank stone, holding on, while the water moved around the stones below them, and the aspens stood bare-limbed against the October sky, and Oakhaven went about its morning 200 yards and a tree line away, unknowing. She looked at the ring. She looked at the mountains. She thought about her father, who had built something from $40 and a handsaw and left it to her because he knew she'd build it further. She thought about what further looked like from where she was standing. It looked like this: the river, and the cold, and the hand in hers, and the work waiting back at the yard, the new shed frame, going up taller than the old one, and a name she was going to have to get used to saying differently. Calloway. She tried it silently. Maeve Calloway. She tried it, and kept it, and let it settle. Then she tightened her hand around his and turned toward the path back to town. And he walked beside her, and the morning opened up ahead of them, clean and cold and full of considerable work to do. The lumberyard came back louder than it had been before. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the new drying shed, though that was remarkable. Taller by 4 feet and ventilated better than anything else on the territory, but the noise of the place, the voices, the sound of more than 2 people working at once, and the different quality of energy that came with it. It had started with Rosa Delaney. She came by the Wednesday after the verdict, tool belt on, no preamble. Said she had 3 days of light work before her next commission, and asked what needed doing. Maeve showed her the shed frame. Rosa looked at it, asked 2 technical questions, and picked up a hammer. Word went around, the way word always went around in Oakhaven. By Thursday, there were 2 more. By the following Monday, there were 6 people working the yard on rotating days, some paid, some trading labor for future lumber credit, all of them there, because they had decided to be, and because the Hollister yard had treated them fairly when other operations hadn't. Jed managed the crew without managing them. That was the only way to describe it. He was simply present in the yard, doing his portion of the work, and when someone needed direction, he gave it clearly and moved on. He didn't hover. He didn't posture. People worked well around him, the way they worked well, in a space organized to make sense, because the conditions were right and the expectations were clear. Maeve watched all of this from the workshop, from the yard, from every angle she had available. She thought about what her father had built from $40. She thought about what she was building now, and it was bigger than what she'd imagined when she was doing it alone. Not just the shed, the whole shape of the operation, what it could become. She started drawing plans on the Thursday evening, at the table by the workshop window. Jed came in from the paddock and found her there. He looked at the drawings for a moment before she explained them. He always did that looked first, so he was responding to what was actually there and not what he'd expected. Horse training facility, he said. North end of the property. There's already good grass if we fence it right, and the terrain varies enough to be useful. She turned the drawing toward him. You know what a proper training ground needs. I know what the land can give. This is a first draft. He sat down across from her and pulled the drawing closer. He studied it. His finger traced the fence line she'd sketched, moved to the paddock layout, stopped at the shelter structure in the northeast corner. This shelter's in the wrong place, he said. Prevailing wind comes from the northwest. Horses need the open side facing south. He picked up her pencil. May I? Go ahead. He redrew the shelter placement. Then he added a second access gate she hadn't thought of. Then he paused, looking at the whole drawing with the focused stillness he brought to things that interested him genuinely. This is a good idea, he said. I know, she said. That almost smile. What's your timeline? Spring for the fencing. Summer for the shelter. First horses by fall if we move well. She took the drawing back. You'd run the training side. I'd run the lumber side. The land supports both, and they don't compete different labor, different seasons, different clients. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. Hollister Sterling, he said. On the sign Hollister Calloway, she said. If the warrant review holds. He was quiet for a moment. When it holds. She accepted that correction. When? The warrant review came back from the Portland circuit on a gray November morning, 6 weeks after the trial. Beaumont brought the official letter to the workshop himself, which told her before she opened it that the news was good. Beaumont was a man who delivered difficult things quietly and good things with his shoulders back. The warrant was formally vacated. The fabrication finding was entered into the federal record. The Portland Circuit noted the Sterling family's role in the original proceeding and referred the matter to the probate court for review of the 1,873 estate settlement. Jed held the letter for a long time, standing in the middle of the workshop with the gray morning light coming through the east window. Maeve stayed at her bench and let him have it. She kept her hands moving on the wood in front of her, a rhythm of steady work, so the silence had a shape to it. After a while, he folded the letter and set it on the shelf above the secondary bench, beside the salve tin, right beside it, deliberate. Jediah Thomas Calloway, she said, not looking up from the bench. That's my name, he said. It is. She pulled a long curl of walnut off the board she was working. Get used to hearing it. I intend to use it often. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. 2 days later, on a cold November afternoon, with the first real snow coming down off the mountains, Maeve hired her first full-time hand. His name was Daniel. He was 19, recently arrived from the coast with no particular plan, good hands, and a willingness to learn that was more valuable than most skills a person could walk in with. He'd been doing odd jobs along the main street for 2 weeks, and Tom Archer had mentioned him to Maeve in the way Tom mentioned people he thought deserved a fair chance. She showed Daniel the yard, the tools, the organization system, the rules. He listened with the complete attention of someone who understood that the listening was the job. Every tool goes back where it came from, she said. Clean. That's not negotiable. He nodded. You'll be paid the same rate as any other hand doing this work. Not less because you're new, not a different rate because of anything else. Fair labor, fair wage. She looked at him directly. I expect the same standard of work from you that I'd expect from anyone. I won't hold you to less. Don't hold yourself to less either. He looked slightly surprised by that. Then he nodded again, more firmly. She handed him the yard broom. Start with the main path. The snow's going to make it worse before it makes it better. He started. By December, the workshop had a rhythm that Maeve hadn't felt since her father was alive, and it was different from his rhythm, shaped by different hands and different voices, but it had the same quality, purposeful, fair, daily. She hired 2 more people in December. A woman named Clara, who had done finished carpentry in Portland and moved west after her husband died, who was faster with a spoke shave than anyone Maeve had ever watched. And a young man named Eli, who was 17 and had been sleeping in the livery stable until Mrs. Miller had noticed and done something about it in the characteristically direct Miller way. Eli was not an experienced carpenter. He was, however, extraordinarily willing to become one, and Maeve had learned from her father that willingness was the foundation you built everything else on. She put him on stock work and basic tool maintenance and showed him the same things her father had shown her, in the same order, for the same reason. She watched him figure out how the hand plane worked one afternoon, the slow, careful process of understanding something physical for the first time. And she thought about being 14 in this same workshop with her father patient beside her. Don't fight it, she said. Follow the grain. Let the tool do the work it's built to do. He tried again. This time the plane moved clean. He looked up at her. Good, she said. Again, equal wages, equal expectations, equal patience with the learning curve that everyone had when they were starting. She'd written it into the pay records from the beginning, and she said it plainly to anyone who asked. This was how the Hollister yard operated. It had always been, and now it was written down and spoken aloud, and the people who worked there knew it and told other people. The territory paid attention to that kind of thing, gradually, in the way territories did slowly, and then all at once. By February, she had more lumber contracts than she could fill with her current capacity, and she and Jed spent 3 evenings at the table by the window, reconfiguring the operations structure. She drew, he modified. She pushed back on 2 of his modifications with technical reasoning. He conceded one and held firm on the other, with technical reasoning of equal weight. And they argued about it honestly, and then arrived at something better than either original position. She liked that. She liked it a lot, that he argued when he had grounds and conceded when she had grounds, and neither of them ran the conversation on anything other than the merits of the thing under discussion. She thought, not for the first time, that this was what her father and mother had been before her mother died. 2 people building something together, with mutual respect and without pretense. She'd only been young when her mother was alive, but she remembered the quality of it, the particular sound of 2 people who actually listened to each other, working through a problem in the same room. The ranch sign went up on a cold March morning. Jed had made it himself over the winter's solid pine, routed lettering, finished with linseed oil. She'd offered to help, and he'd said he wanted to make this one, and she'd understood that and let him. He came in from the paddock before breakfast and said, "Come outside." She went. The sign was on the post at the yard gate. New wood, fresh lettering. The linseed finish gleaming in the pale morning light. Hollister Callaway Ranch and Lumber. She stood and looked at it for a while. The mountains were behind it, enormous and white and permanent, and the yard was starting to come awake around them. She could hear Daniel starting on the morning stack work, the familiar sound of wood shifting and the scrape of the yard broom. The new drying shed stood against the northeast corner, taller and better ventilated and twice the capacity of the old one, and the fencing for the training ground was half finished along the north side of the property. Her name, his name, side by side, in routed pine letters on solid timber. She pressed her hand flat against the post. The wood was cold and solid under her palm. Your grandfather would have had something to say about a Callaway and a Hollister joining up, she said. He would have said it was about time. One of his grandchildren had some sense, Jed said. She laughed. Outside, in the cold March morning, with sawdust already on her coat, and the whole long day of work ahead of them, she laughed properly, and the sound of it went out across the yard, and the mountain wind carried it somewhere. He reached over and took her hand. They stood at the gate together for a moment, looking at the sign. Then she squeezed his hand once, let go, and went back to the workshop. There was work to do. 3 years later, October came back to Oakhaven the way it always did, without much ceremony. Just a shift in the light and a smell off the mountains and the aspens, turning overnight from green to a yellow so bright it almost hurt to look at. Maeve noticed it first from the workshop window, as she noticed most things. She was at the bench in the late afternoon, doing finish work on a commission that had come from a rancher 2 valleys over a set of display cabinets. Walnut, with carved detail on the frame corners. Good work. The kind she'd been doing more of since the yard's reputation had grown past Oakhaven proper and into the broader territory. She heard the toddler before she saw her. A small person appeared in the workshop doorway, making the particular purposeful sound of a child who has decided to go somewhere and has gone there. She was 2.5, dark-haired like her father, with her mother's serious brown eyes and a current deep interest in wood shavings, which she collected and carried around in her pockets. Maeve set down the carving tool. "What are you doing in here?" "Wood," said May, with complete clarity of purpose. "The shavings are this end," Maeve said, shifting on the stool to make room. "Come here." May crossed the workshop floor with the deliberate gait of someone who had learned to walk recently and was still committed to each step. She arrived at Maeve's side and held up her hands. Maeve lifted her onto the stool beside her. "Now," she said, "watch." She picked up a small off-cut piece, a short length of clear pine that was going to waste anyway, and she showed May how to hold a piece of wood, both hands steady so you could feel what it was doing. May gripped it with her whole fists and looked at it with complete concentration. "Feel the grain?" Maeve ran May's finger along the wood's length. "That's how the tree grew. You always work with it, not against it. Remember that." May examined the piece of pine with the focused attention of someone receiving important information. Then she looked up at her mother. "Again," she said. Maeve smiled. She showed her again. She showed her 3 more times, each time explaining the grain, the direction, how you could feel it shift under your finger when you changed angle. May absorbed every repetition without impatience. That was her father's quality. Maeve thought that particular willingness to stay with something until it was understood. She handed May a small scrap piece to keep. May turned it over in both hands, studying it. "For your pocket," Maeve said. May transferred it to her pocket with great care, alongside whatever wood shavings were already in there, and sat on the stool and swung her legs. Outside, the late afternoon was going gold. The mountain peaks across the valley were catching the last of the sun on their high faces, and the light that came through the workshop's east window was the particular amber of October evenings, warm and lateral, laying itself across the workbench in a way that made the walnut grain of the commission pieces glow. She heard hooves on the road, easy ones, measured pace. She knew that sound. She heard him come through the yard gate and cross to the paddock, heard the low sound of his voice as he put Colt up for the night, the horse's answering sound, and the quiet that followed while they went through their end-of-day ritual. She'd stopped watching it from the window, not because it wasn't worth watching, but because it happened every evening and had become part of the day's sound the way the workshop tools had background, reliable hers. A few minutes later, his boots crossed the yard. He came in through the workshop door and stopped when he saw them Maeve at the bench, May beside her on the stool, both of them looking at a piece of walnut with an identical quality of attention that made something shift in his face. He stood in the doorway a moment without speaking. Then he crossed the workshop. He came up behind Maeve and put his arms around her from behind, his chin at the side of her head, and looked at the piece of wood she'd been working. His hands settled at her waist, easy and certain, the way they'd settled there 1,000 times in 3 years. She leaned back against him slightly. "Just enough, Papa," said May, holding up her pine scrap. "What have you got?" he said. "Wood," May said. "Good wood?" May considered this seriously. "Yes." "Your mother show you the grain?" "Yes." "Good." He looked over Maeve's shoulder at the commission piece on the bench, the carving on the corner frame, the one she'd been detailing for the past hour. "That's fine work, I know," she said. She felt him smile against her hair. Outside, the October wind came down off the mountain and moved through the yard, through the lumber stacks, and past the new drying shed and around the corner of the workshop. It rattled the sign at the gate. She could hear it. Hollister Kellaway, the wood creaking in its post, fittings the way wood always did in the seasonal change. The training ground was full of horses, 6 of them now, 3 belonging to ranchers who'd brought them for the winter training program, 2 belonging to the ranch itself, and 1 young gray that Jed had been working with for 2 months and was coming along better than expected. The operation had built steadily, season by season, the way everything she trusted was built without shortcuts, with attention to each piece as it went in. She thought about the sign the way she sometimes did, quietly, and without making it into more than it was. Her name and his name together on solid timber. What it meant and what it had taken to get there, and what she'd had know about herself before she could let it mean what it meant. She thought about Monty. She didn't think about him much anymore, and that itself was something she'd had to build deliberately. He was serving his sentence. Last she'd heard from Vance, the territorial proceeding had gone to Portland as expected, and the circuit court had not been merciful. The corrupt Sheriff Briggs had taken a deal in exchange for testimony and was no longer in Oak Haven or its environs. The Chicago Pacific Railroad had found a different corridor for their line, farther south, through land they'd acquired through legitimate means. Vivienne wrote twice a year from Cincinnati. Her letters were careful and precise, and increasingly themselves less managed, more direct, more likely to include something that had made her laugh. The last letter had described a garden and an aunt who apparently had opinions about roses and was not shy about expressing them, and something in the quality of the writing had told Maeve that the woman she'd met in the rain at midnight was becoming more herself than she'd been in years. She was glad for that, simply, and without complication. She was glad. May had found another wood shaving on the bench and was examining it with the same thoroughness she'd given the pine scrap. She was talking to it softly, in the private language of toddlers that had its own logic if you listened to it long enough. Jed's arms were still around Maeve's waist. She picked up the carving tool again and leaned forward slightly to get the right angle, and he shifted to give her the room without her asking, because after 3 years he knew the geometry of her work, the way she knew the geometry of his. She could feel the steadiness of him behind her, not holding her in place. Just there, present. The particular quality of a person who was not going anywhere. "Daniel finished the last of the north stack today," he said, It's stacked right. He's getting better. He's been getting better since his third week, she said. He just had to get out of his own way. Clara's commission from the Valley Rancher came through. She wants to know if she can use the bench on Sundays when you're not in. Tell her yes. Tell her she can use whatever she needs. Eli had passed his first full year at the yard in August, and she'd given him a small raise and shown him the joinery work she'd been saving for when he was ready. He'd bent over the first practice joint for 40 minutes and come out the other side with something that was nearly right, and the expression on his face had been the expression she knew from her own face years ago, the look of understanding, settling into your hands. She'd given him her father's smallest chisel set when he'd gotten it right, the one her father had given her. He'd held them for a long moment and then thanked her in a voice that was trying to be ordinary and wasn't quite getting there. She'd said nothing about that, just told him to put them somewhere he could find them. She made the last stroke on the corner carving and set the tool down. It was a pine branch, small and precise, pressed into the cabinet frame where a hand might find it, where someone someday, moving a vase or pulling out a drawer, might feel the shape of it under their fingers without knowing what it was or where it came from. Her father had done it first. He'd kept the habit. She'd taught Eli to do it last spring, on his first finish piece, and he'd done it carefully and well. Good, Jed said, looking at the carving over her shoulder. Good, she said. May had fallen asleep on the stool, her cheek against the workbench edge, the pine scrap still in her hand. She did this, went from fully operational to entirely asleep in the space of 5 minutes, without transition or warning. Jed came around and looked at her with the expression he always had when he found her like this. He picked her up carefully, one arm under her knees and one at her back, and May made a small sound and didn't wake. Maeve watched him hold their daughter. The burn scar on his forearm, visible below his rolled sleeve, the wrist marks long since faded to nothing. The steadiness with which he held her, not tense, not cautious, just completely present and reliable. The way he'd been since the beginning. She thought about 2 words at a stagecoach station. She thought about a signed agreement on a workbench, about ash smell in the yard, and rain on the roof, and iron shackles, and a man saying, "Everything I felt for you was real in the middle of a downpour." She didn't believe in the version of the story where things worked out 'cause they were supposed to. She'd seen enough of how things actually went to know better than that. She believed in the version where you held your chin level and walked the road in the rain and went to Vance at midnight because it needed doing that night and not tomorrow. She believed in work, in fair wages and good tools, and showing up every morning, in the way a community returned what you gave it if you gave it something worth returning. She stood up from the bench. She put her carving tools on their hooks, in order, clean. She covered the commission piece with the cloth she kept for the purpose. She blew out the bench lamp and left the door lamp burning for Jed to close up after. She walked to where he was standing with May, and she pressed her hand flat against her daughter's back, feeling the small, steady rise and fall of her breathing. May had her father's eyelashes and her grandmother's chin, which Maeve knew from the photograph her father had kept. She had already, at 2.5, a quality of attention that was going to make her formidable at whatever she decided to turn it toward. Maeve looked forward to finding out what that would be. She reached up and touched the side of Jed's face, briefly her calloused hand, his weathered cheek, and he turned and looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, without calculation, without management, just directly, with everything he meant right there on the surface. "Supper," she said. "I'll put her down," he said. She went ahead into the house. Outside, the October wind moved through the yard again, through the lumber stacks in the new drying shed, and the training ground where the horses were settling for the night. It moved up the mountain line and out across the territory, carrying the smell of pine and the coming cold. The yard was bigger than her father had built it. The sign had 2 names on it. The workshop had 5 people in it during the days, and tools on every hook, and a commission book that ran 3 months ahead. The scars on Jed's arm had faded to silver, the way old scars did. Her own hands were calloused and stained in the ways her hands had always been, and she did not think about that as a flaw. She thought about it as information, evidence of the work, evidence of the life. She put water on for coffee. Jed came in from the back room where May slept, quiet-footed, and went to the basin to wash his hands. She heard the water, the familiar sequence of sound that meant the day was ending and the evening was starting. He came and stood beside her, at the stove. She handed him a cup. They stood together in the kitchen, in the October evening, while the wind moved outside, and the mountains held the cold, and the yard was quiet, and the sign at the gate caught the last light. A scrap of pine in a small pocket, a pine branch carved where a hand might find it. A name on a sign in routed letters on solid timber. Some things you built once, some things you kept building every day until they were more permanent than anything stone could hold. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside, Oak Haven settled into dark, and the stars came out above the mountain line in their hundreds. The same stars that had always been there, indifferent and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human fact of two people standing in a warm kitchen after a long day, holding their cups. That was all right. She had never needed the stars to pay attention. She had work and a yard and a name beside hers and a daughter who already knew how to feel for grain direction in a piece of pine. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. There's something I want you to sit with for a moment before you go. Maeve Hollister was 21 years old when a man stood up in front of everyone she knew and told the world she wasn't enough. Not small enough. Not polished enough. Not the right kind of woman for a man with ambitions. And she was wearing her mother's wedding dress when he said it. She didn't fall apart. She went back to the workshop the next morning and picked up a planer. That's who she was. That's who she'd always been. But carrying that kind of wound quietly, pretending it didn't leave a mark, that's its own kind of weight. The kind you don't notice until someone sets a full plate in front of you and says, simply and without ceremony, that you deserve to eat. Jed didn't tell Maeve she was beautiful to fix her. He didn't say it to win something from her. He said it because it was true, and because he'd watched her hoist a 12-foot beam in the afternoon heat and speak back to a man twice her nerve, and what he saw was exactly what was there, a formidable, capable, worthy woman who had been lied to about her own value for so long she'd started to believe it. He corrected the record. That's all. Just the record, set straight. And that's the first thing this story is really about. The lies we absorb from people who should have protected us. The way those lies settle in and become background noise, the voice that tells you to eat less, take up less space, want less, ask for less. Maeve's story says that voice is not the truth. It never was. Your body is not the problem. Your size is not the obstacle. The people who told you otherwise were wrong, and their wrongness is not something you have to keep carrying. The second thing this story is about is what it actually takes to rebuild. Not the dramatic version, the real version. The version where you show up the next morning with sawdust on your coat and a list of things that need doing. Where you organize your evidence before the sun comes up. Where you walk 3/4 of a mile in the rain at midnight because it needs to be done that night and not tomorrow. Maeve didn't wait to be rescued. She mobilized a town. She walked into a courtroom and asked the questions no one else was asking. She did it while she was angry and scared, and still working through a betrayal she hadn't finished processing yet. That's what courage actually looks like. It doesn't wait until conditions are perfect. The third thing, and maybe the quietest, is about what fair treatment really means in practice. Maeve paid equal wages when other yards were cutting rates. She sold chisels on credit to a woman with $11. She hired people who needed a chance and held them to the same standard she held everyone else because equal respect and equal expectation go together. Those choices came back to her when she needed them most. Not because she was calculating, she wasn't. She just believed that every person who showed up to work deserved to be treated like their labor had value, and their name was worth knowing. The town she'd built around herself, one fair transaction at a time, is what walked into that courtroom with her. And then there's Vivienne, a woman on the wrong side of the story, trapped there by choices she didn't fully make and couldn't easily unmake. What Maeve offered her wasn't pity. It wasn't a rescue. It was a hand down from a tilted carriage and a simple statement, I don't have any reason not to help you. That single act of ordinary decency planted something. And when the moment came, Vivienne Sterling walked into a frontier courtroom alone, under oath, with a ledger and a letter, and the full weight of what she knew, and she put it on the table. That's what it looks like when someone remembers what they're capable of. Sometimes all it takes is one person who treats you like you still have it in you. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and inspirational purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental.